Good morning. Welcome to the first day of the Business of Alaska Rural Energy Project Development and Operational Sustainability virtual workshop sponsored by the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Alaska Center for Energy and Power. I'm Dominique Pride, Research Associate Professor for the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Alaska Center for Energy and Power. I'll be your MC for today's event. Thank you so much for joining us. This topic is near and dear to my heart. Most of my research focuses on the high residential energy costs we face in Alaska. So once again, thank you for joining us. I would like to start off with an overview of the workshop series. This workshop is the second of 4 in our Continuing Conversations virtual workshop series. The purpose of these free quarterly workshops is to sustain our conversations, strengthen relationships, and share knowledge among this energy-focused community between the 2025 and the 2026 Alaska Sustainable Energy Conferences. We kicked off back in August with Lessons in Transmission Planning. We're thrilled to be hosting the Business of Alaska Rural Energy this week. Our third workshop, Beyond the Basics, the potential role of advanced nuclear in Alaska, will take place on January 27th and 28th of 2026. Then we will wrap up with our final workshop, the topic of which will be announced soon in April 2026 before the 5th Annual Sustainable Energy Conference happening at the Dena'ina Center and Convention Center in the Dena'ina Civic and Convention Center in Anchorage on May 19th through the 21st, 2026. We have identified several topics we believe deserve a deeper dive than time will allow at the main conference, subjects that are both relevant and timely given current interests or near-term opportunities in each of these cases. Our goal is to bring some of the top experts and practitioners together and present these workshops with a bit of an Alaska spin on them, or at least hear from speakers with information we think is highly relevant to an Alaska audience. Looking forward at our time together today, please see our agenda up on the screen here for the daily program overview. We're going to kick it off right now with our welcome remarks. At 8:45, we'll have the Rural Energy at a Crossroads with Katie. Next, at 9:30, we will dive into PCE 101 before a break at 10:15. We'll reconvene at 10:30 with the Regulatory Commission of Alaska. At 11, we will have When the Storm Hits, and that's about the typhoon. At 11:45, we will look at microgrids, macro challenges, and then we'll wrap it up at 12:30 with closing remarks. Next, tomorrow, just a preview, we will have Do Renewables Actually Save Money in Rural Alaska, followed by Pooling Regional Resources before our break. We'll also cover at 10:30 Bulk Fuel Aggregation Study. At 11, we'll hit Building a Utility Collaborative. And lastly, we will have the Independent Power Producers. Right now, we'd like to kick off this morning's program with a few engagement polls to learn a little more about our audience. To participate, you can simply scan the QR code on the screen here with your mobile device, or you can visit slido.com and enter the code 1904537. That link is also available in the chat. For our first question, we want to know where you are from. Tell us, where are you participating in today's workshop from? Simply type your answer in the submission box and click the green send button. We have a person joining from Utah. Welcome. Colorado, Anchorage, more Anchorage, no surprise. We have Fairbanks, Old Harbor, Juneau, Anchorage, California, more Anchorage, Nome, Anchorage, Michigan. Looks like we have a lot of participation in Anchorage and Fairbanks. Montana, Sandpoint. Another Idaho, Fairbanks, Elim, Fairbanks, Palmer. Los Angeles, Bend, Oregon, North Carolina, Nome, Colorado. Denina Lands, Homer. All right. Sounds like we have good representation from Alaska and across the Western United States. Oh, Illinois, DC, Southeast. Excellent. Thank you. Bethel. All right. So for our next question, we would love to know when you think about energy in rural Alaska, what words come to mind for you? Personally, I think about diesel and microgrids. Ah, expensive. Yes, definitely. Me too. Diesel reliability, resilience, expensive, costly, challenging, hydro fragile, high prices, difficult, challenging conditions, unreliable, renewables, isolated. It looks like expensive, challenging, and diesel resilience. Yep. All righty. Thank you. That's really interesting with that word cloud. Okay. For next up, we are curious to know what portion of your household income do you estimate is spent on energy costs, including electricity and home heating? For reference, the US average is about 3%. So this is an area that I'm really interested in studying. 6% or higher is considered a highly energy cost burden. And in Alaska, I think a lot of us spend much more than that, especially in our off-road communities that are relying on diesel for both space heating and electricity. So it looks like a majority of people are saying 3 to 5% of their household income is spent on electricity and home heating, followed by the 5 to 10%. All right, I'll give everybody a few more seconds. Okay, it looks like 3 to 5% seems to be the percentage that people are spending. For our last poll, we would like to know, what do you see as the biggest energy challenge or challenges currently faced by rural Alaska communities? Let's see what answers are coming in. Climate, sustainability, resiliency, transportation, costs, a lack of distribution network, funding, lack of funding for infrastructure, maintenance, lack of scale, location, infrastructure, reliability, loss of federal incentives for renewables, cost of renewable infrastructure, reliability, maintenance, climate funding, lack of diversity, logistics, sustainability, lack of sun. All righty, it seems like we have a lot of interest in climate and fuel costs. All righty. Well, thank you for answering those polls. Very interesting, interesting answers. Next, I'd like to move on to some housekeeping. So let's review a few items. Please introduce yourself in the chat, share your name and the organization you're with. If time allows, presenters will be answering audience questions immediately following each presentation. So be sure to submit your comments and questions in the chat. Simply type your questions in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. During Q&A, I'll be reading your submitted questions out loud to our presenters. If we do not get answers to every question during the Q&A, the presenters will do their best to respond via the chat or follow up after the event. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties during the virtual event, you can send a chat message to event support. Our technical team is on standby to assist you. Recordings of each of the virtual workshops are available at the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference website at www.alaskasustainableenergy.com/virtual-workshops. As we know, there was a terrible storm in Western Alaska that very heavily impacted several communities, including Kipnuk and Kong. And so we want you to know that we're thinking about this. And if you're interested in supporting relief efforts, please visit Alaska Community Foundation Western Disaster Relief 2025 Fund and the Association of Village Council Presidents Typhoon Halong support websites to see how you can help. We are dropping links for both of these resources in the chat for you now. Thank you for participating in the polls this morning. I'd like I would now like to invite Andrew Jensen, Policy Advisor to the Office of the Governor of the State of Alaska, to share words before we hear some recorded remarks from Governor Dunleavy himself. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you, Dominique, and thank you to ACEP for continuing to host these workshops. And certainly to Katie Conway, the Denali Commission, who's been a huge help with this. And of course to our team at Government Event Services for putting this on. And especially thanks to everybody for logging in and spending some time with us today. So I am pleased to introduce this video by Governor Mike Dunleavy. And you may notice as the video plays that there's no reference to the storm that just happened a couple of weeks ago. And that was because it was obviously recorded the week before. And so obviously the governor has been incredibly engaged with this effort, from the rescue, the recovery efforts, and being in DC last week when President Trump signed the federal disaster declaration for Western Alaska. So, I think as everyone knows, the people of Western Alaska have a special place for Governor Dunleavy, and he knows how resilient the people of these communities are. So he's going to continue to work to ensure that the rebuilding process, the recovery process will continue in Western Alaska. And with that, I would like to throw it to the video for welcome remarks from Governor Mike Dunleavy.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this very important discussion. Today's workshop continues our Continuing the Conversation series, building on the ideas and momentum sparked by the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference. These sessions help us keep that energy moving forward, working together to find real, lasting solutions for Alaska's energy future. Today's topic, the business of Alaska rural energy, is one that's especially close to my heart. I spent more than 20 years living and working in rural Alaska. I know what it means to depend upon a single generator, a single barge delivery of fuel, or a handful of people who keep the lights on when something breaks. In these communities, energy isn't abstract. It's personal, and it's vital to everything else that happens. Across our roughly 200 isolated villages, these systems are the backbone of everyday life, providing heat, electricity, and transportation. But many are aging, expensive to maintain, and increasingly hard to replace. We're looking at more than $1.5 billion in deferred maintenance alone. The gap between community needs and available resources continues to widen. That's why this workshop is so important. If we're going to build a sustainable energy future for Alaska, we have to think differently about how we fund, finance, and support these systems. Public dollars alone won't be enough. We need to build stronger partnerships between state, federal, tribal, and private sectors. We need to create space for the innovation, new business models, and investment that aligns local opportunity with long-term reliability. Alaskans have always been problem solvers. We know how to work with what we have, and we know how to build things that last. This is another opportunity to bring that same ingenuity to the business of rural energy, finding ways to make projects pencil out and communities thrive. You'll hear today from experts and local leaders who are doing just that, developing projects, maintaining operations, and finding new ways to keep energy systems reliable and affordable. I encourage you to listen, challenge assumptions, and think about how we can turn ideas into action. Our administration's goals remain clear: affordable, reliable energy for every Alaskan, and I believe that by working together, public and private sectors alike, we can make that a reality. So thank you for being part of this great effort and for everything you do to move our state forward. So let's get started.
Okay, thank you, Governor Dunleavy, for your message. And with that, I would now like to invite Katie Conway, Energy and Bulk Fuel Program Manager at the Denali Commission, to join me for this morning's presentation, Rural Energy at a Crossroad, the systems that keep Alaska's communities running. She'll later be joined by Jade Powell, Training Manager at Rural Energy Alaska Project, or REAP. This opening session sets the stage for the workshop with a grounded look at how rural Alaska's energy systems function and the forces that sustain or threaten them. Katie will outline how power generation, distribution, and bulk fuel systems form the backbone of community function and resilience, and discuss the challenges shaping their future. Jade will add practical field-level insights from working with the rural utility operators and managers across Alaska. As Katie is coming on the stage, let me tell you a little bit about our presenters. Katie manages the Denali Commission's Energy Bulk Fuel Program. overseeing projects and initiatives that strengthen rural Alaska's power systems, bulk fuel facilities, and overall community energy security. With nearly 20 years of experience in Alaska's energy and infrastructure sectors and a master's in applied anthropology, she brings a deep understanding of the connection between people, place, and the built environment in Alaska's remote communities. As REAP's training manager, Jade manages the People Empower program. They develop tools for workforce assessment and training and are building relationships with rural utilities to provide regular community-specific training programs to improve utility operations and management. As a reminder, if time allows, Katie and Jade will be answering audience questions immediately following their presentations. So be sure to submit your comments and questions in the chat. Simply type your questions in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. If we do not get to answer every question during the Q&A, the presenters will do their best to respond via the chat or follow up after the event. Welcome, Katie.
Good morning, and thanks for the introduction, Dominique. Like you said, I manage the Denali Commission's Energy and Bulk Fuel program, and it's really an honor to help kick off this two-day workshop. Thank you to the moderator for the opening poll. It was really useful to know who's with us today and get a better sense of how familiar folks are with Alaska's rural energy landscape. My goal over the next 20-ish minutes is to help set the stage for all of the conversations ahead over the next 2 days, to describe what rural Alaska's energy systems look like, what challenges they face, and why sustainability and affordability are such persistent and intertwined issues. Over the next 2 days, we'll move from defining the problem, understanding the systems and the obstacles, that's today, to exploring practical, place-based solutions that communities, utilities, and partners are already testing around the state, and that's tomorrow. Think of today as the big picture map that helps to orient what comes next in the conversation. I'll start with a little Rural Energy 101, mostly for folks in the audience who aren't as familiar with how different things are in Alaska's villages. Rural Alaska is characterized by small, isolated communities with small populations and limited capacity. The villages have to be entirely self-sufficient because of their remoteness, which means islanded microgrids, mostly diesel-powered, and fuel storage facilities that store the liquid fuels used for power generation, heating, and transportation in between very limited seasonal barge deliveries or sometimes airplane. Village economies are primarily subsistence-based with few full-time jobs, and cash flows for all organizations and households are usually very constrained. Across rural Alaska, about 200 communities depend on standalone power and fuel systems. There are no interties to the rail belt, no neighboring utilities to lean on, and very little margin for error. Each system has a few key components: a diesel powerhouse, a distribution system. In some places, renewables are integrated like wind, solar, or hydro, and that can offset diesel use when conditions allow, and one or more bulk fuel tank farms that store the liquid fuels needed for power generation, heating buildings, and powering vehicles. In most places, that fuel arrives by seasonal barges or for communities that run out in between deliveries or in communities that don't have barge access, fuel has to be shipped in by plane at an even greater expense. Once it's on site, the community must safely store and manage it until the next delivery. So maintaining fuel farms isn't just about preventing spills or protecting the surrounding environment. It's a critical aspect of the community energy system that's just as important as maintaining the other components of the village energy system. And these facilities together, the powerhouse, the tank farm, and the distribution system, and maybe the renewables, are foundational village infrastructure supporting life, health, and safety. If one fails, everything else in the community is at risk and potentially impacted. For example, when the power goes out, it's not just an energy emergency, it can quickly become a public health emergency if above ground water sewer pipes freeze. These systems make modern life possible in places that are often hundreds of miles from the road system. But they also represent a fragile and very easily upset balance: aging assets, complex logistics, and operating costs that are among the highest in the nation. To put some numbers on that, last winter, January 2025, according to DCRA's fuel report, gasoline averaged $6.69 per gallon across Alaska, more than double the US average of $2.95 a gallon, with rural communities often paying significantly higher than that. Gas in Scammon Bay, for instance, at the time of the survey, was $9.38 a gallon. That difference, the high cost of liquid fuels in rural Alaska, ripples through everything: freight, groceries, heating, travel, and the cost of power. The extremely high cost of fuel, combined with complex logistics, harsh and rapidly changing environmental conditions, and limited local capacity, has led to a perfect storm of conditions now threatening our rural communities. Infrastructure is deteriorating faster than our ability to address deficiencies. Ultimately, cost is a root cause, and one of the primary drivers of that high cost is the lack of scale. In order to make meaningful, long-lasting change to improve the sustainability of our critical energy systems, managing costs for consumers must be the first consideration. We might not be able to reduce costs as much as we'd like, or maybe not at all, but we absolutely cannot suggest solutions that might increase them. The scale of rural Alaska is so minuscule compared to the rest of the state or anywhere else in the nation, and this is a barrier in all things, including the delivery of safe, reliable, and affordable energy for electricity, heat, and transportation. And it's a very hard reality to convey, especially for folks not familiar with the way things work in rural Alaska, and that can include a lot of people here in Anchorage. Most rural communities have populations of less than 400 people. That means there's a limited customer base to share the fixed costs of building and operating power generation and fuel storage infrastructure. A powerhouse serving 300 people still needs trained operators, spare parts, insurance, and regulatory compliance, which are the same obligations as a utility serving 30,000 people, but with a fraction of the revenue. Now add in logistics, remote transport, seasonal barges, short construction windows, and freight rates that can double or triple project costs. Scale can be really tough, and it's not always an equal challenge. It can look very different between Alaska's regional hubs and its smallest villages. Villages are often single operator systems serving sometimes a few dozen to maybe 700 or 800 people. These are fully isolated with limited staff and costly logistics. With such small customer bases, these systems run on razor-thin margins where even a small unexpected cost can derail an annual budget. I'll note the picture on the left is of Noatak in the Northwest Arctic, and what you can see there in the built environment is fairly typical for a village. However, this particular village is one of the 59 communities served by the state's largest rural utility cooperative, AVEC, and so their scale challenges look different from communities operating a standalone electric utility. There's a lot of variability within this challenge of scale, even at the village level. And I'll also mention that you'll be hearing from Bill Stamm, AVEC's president and CEO, later today. Regional hubs like Nome, Dillingham, or Kotzebue, which you can see on the right, serve larger populations and sometimes even nearby communities. Their utilities have more staff, revenue diversity, and greater access to trades and freight, which gives them modest economies of scale, though their costs remain high and infrastructure is still aging. The kinds of solutions that might work in hubs might not always translate to the villages as an opportunity, which face deep structural barriers. The villages, these are smaller economies, more limited cash flow, and higher per unit costs. Nowhere are the challenges easy, but in the villages, the math is a lot tougher. And in this environment, construction costs for energy infrastructure are extraordinarily high and continuing to rise. Even modest projects can run into the millions because every single thing, every piece of material, equipment, or maybe contracted expertise has to be brought in during seasonal windows and usually at very great expense. For decades, the backbone of rural energy project development has been federal and state grants. This is a model that's delivered real success. Many of the power systems and bulk fuel tank farm facilities operating today exist because of those investments. But as facilities age and degrade, as costs continue to climb faster than available funding, the gap between need and resources keeps widening. Even now, as new grants come through, they're not currently keeping pace with the backlog of facility deficiencies, putting vulnerable communities at even greater risk. Across the state, to echo what the governor mentioned in his opening remarks, bulk fuel system deficiencies exceed $1 billion, with another estimated 400 million or more in needed power system upgrades. And those numbers are growing faster than the funding streams meant to address them. This is the core challenge of our work. Small communities, large infrastructure, high risk, and very thin margins. When systems don't get maintained, not because communities don't care, but because cash flow and staffing are limited, equipment wears out early. Facilities designed for 30 years might last only half that or less. And the other end of the extreme is also worth noting. Some bulk fuel facilities around rural Alaska today are the original BIA tanks placed there 50 or 60 years ago. The gap between design life and actual life is one reason why sustainability is at the center of this conversation and the focus of some of what we'll talk about at the workshop. The fact that some facilities are so extremely outdated is another. This is where the Denali Commission comes in. The commission was created by Congress 25 years ago to improve infrastructure and economic opportunity across rural Alaska. The Energy and Bulk Fuel Program has been and probably will remain a core focus area since day one and has directed hundreds of millions of dollars into rural power systems and bulk fuel tank farms, as well as the ancillary programs and initiatives that support that infrastructure over time, like training, workforce development, and technical assistance. The Commission has been and remains one of the primary funders of rural power systems and bulk fuel tank farms across rural Alaska. To date, the Commission has helped modernize or replace facilities in more than 170 communities statewide, working closely with partners like the Alaska Energy Authority, Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, utilities like AVEC, many tribal and local governments, the university, and others. And yet, even with these investments, the need for critical repairs or rebuilds of energy infrastructure across rural Alaska is high and rising. Many of the facilities the Commission helped to build 25 years ago are now aged beyond repair. Environmental conditions have changed so significantly, now there's an increasing number of facilities at risk of erosion, permafrost degradation, and flooding, adding to the already overwhelmingly high list of priority projects. Annual funding has generally been static at best, and meanwhile, the estimated cost of projects is on a steeply increasing trajectory. What we could do with $10 million a decade ago is far less today. On top of all of this, operational costs are often shortchanged by necessity, worsening facility condition and increasing the collective need for critical capital improvement funding. The longer the villages are unable to meet today's needs, the higher the anticipated cost to meet those needs in the future. To date, the Commission has helped modernize or replace energy and bulk fuel facilities across most of rural Alaska. Most of those upgrades, like new powerhouses and tank farms, happened in the Commission's early years when our annual appropriations were well over $100 million. We're still at it today, though with less funding and far greater need. I don't want to give the impression that grants are gone. They're still absolutely essential. But the reality is that there isn't enough grant funding collectively to keep pace with the high and rising costs of projects or the growing backlog of facilities that need work. That said, I'd like to share a bright spot and use this as a kind of case study to illustrate what's possible and what it takes. This past summer, the Denali Commission launched a $100 million EPA-funded program to upgrade bulk fuel facilities in 10 rural communities. This was a huge win for Alaska. We're calling it the Alaska Bulk Fuel Infrastructure Partnership, which might be the hardest acronym to pronounce, ABFIP. The grant was awarded to ANTHC, which is serving as the project director for this multi-community initiative. And what makes the funding so significant is that it doesn't require a local or non-federal match, which is pretty rare for construction funding. Our focus under this initiative is squarely on capital improvements, getting essential infrastructure built or replaced to improve safety, reliability, and environmental performance. We're not funding training or planning directly under this program, but we absolutely recognize how important those pieces are for long-term sustainability. Looking ahead, our goal is to replicate this model, pairing continued investment in critical infrastructure with stronger coordination and smarter delivery. Even with funding at this scale, the need far exceeds what's available, so we have to make every dollar count through things like shared procurement, batched projects, and coordinated mobilization efforts that help stretch limited funding as far as possible. Across rural Alaska, infrastructure rarely fails all at once. It typically erodes over time. The exception, of course, is the devastating impacts of severe weather events like what we recently saw when the remnants of Typhoon Halong tore into the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. You'll be hearing an update about the storm's impact and how AEA assists in all types of energy emergencies from Chris McConnell at AEA later today. When operating budgets are tight, preventative maintenance becomes reactive maintenance. Deferred repairs stack up until something breaks, which might be during the coldest week of the year. And these patterns aren't unique to one community, they're structural. They stem from limited cash flow, high freight costs, seasonal access, and the difficulty of recruiting and retaining qualified operators. It's worth mentioning again that the cost of energy itself is a fundamental part of this problem. In many communities, the price of fuel is already debilitatingly high, and that financial strain limits the ability to plan for the future. I recently heard from one tank farm operator who said they intentionally don't maintain a repair and replacement account because doing so would require a rate surcharge that residents simply can't afford on top of the already high cost of fuel. And this is a perfect example of how high costs today undermine sustainability tomorrow. Communities are forced frequently to make impossible trade-offs between affordability for residents and the long-term health of their infrastructure. When systems fail prematurely, the consequences cascade. Energy insecurity, fuel spills, and costly emergency rebuilds, not to mention threats to life, health, and safety. And that's why sustainability, both operational and financial, is as critical as addressing acute deficiencies. Sustainability depends on three things working together: building or replacing what's worn out through capital investments, funding and expertise for maintenance and compliance through operational support, and making sure that people with the skills and tools to keep systems running are there when we need them, helping to build local capacity. When any one of those pieces falls short, the whole system suffers. And across much of rural Alaska, we're seeing the effects of that imbalance. Infrastructure wears out faster than it can be replaced, operators are stretched thin, and funding models struggle to keep up with rising costs, putting communities more at risk. The flip side is that when we make improvements, even when they don't lower consumer rates or they don't lower rates as much as we'd like, they can still deliver major benefits: fewer catastrophic failures, longer lasting infrastructure, safer operations and fewer spills, and greater reliability for all of the essential services depending on that energy. Across rural Alaska, every investment we make, whether in power and fuel systems or in the people who manage and care for them, is about creating systems that last and resilient, secure communities. To wrap up, this brings us to where we are today, the crossroads. Across rural Alaska, capital project funding has fallen sharply while per project costs have risen dramatically, creating a widening gap between what's needed and what current resources can deliver. At the same time, funding for operations and maintenance, the work that keeps these systems safe and functional, often falls short. For decades, grant funding has been the backbone of rural energy project development, and it has accomplished an enormous amount. But grant funding alone may no longer be enough to meet the scale of need or to sustain infrastructure once it's built. That doesn't mean the solution is to stop investing. Far from it. It means we need to invest differently, more collaboratively, more efficiently, with innovation and with long-term sustainability in mind. We're already starting to see signs of innovation, new strategies aimed at overcoming the fundamental challenges of cost, scale, and risk that define rural Alaska's energy landscape. Some of those efforts are being explored right now through initiatives like the Alaska Bulk Fuel Infrastructure Partnership, I'm not even attempting that acronym, which seeks to stretch limited grant dollars further through a scaled, coordinated delivery approach. There's also the Bulk Fuel Aggregation Study, which will examine ways to build economies of scale for improved facility performance and to better meet community long-term needs through bundled O&M. There are regional approaches like what Lake and Penboro is trying to do with their utility collaborative, and new business models like independent power producers for renewable energy systems. You're going to hear much more about those tomorrow during the sessions, and each one looking at a different approach to building resilience, sustainability, and ultimately community security. Before we move into the next discussion, I'll bring this conversation back to the people at the center of it all. And I'd like to introduce Jade from REAP. Through REAP's People in Power initiative, Jade has spent the past 2 years talking with the people who keep these systems running, utility managers, operators, and rural community leaders. Jade is going to share what he's learned from those working directly on the ground, their realities, and what sustainability means from their perspectives. What he's learned connects directly to the conversation after hours about power cost equalization, the mechanism designed to help level the playing field for rural ratepayers. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jade to share what he's been hearing from the field, the real lived experience behind the systems that keep Alaska's communities running. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for that great presentation and introduction to the landscape for everybody, Katie. Yeah, as Katie mentioned, my name is Jade, and I work at Renewable Energy Alaska Project, or REAP, and I'm our training manager and run a program called People in Power, or PIP, that is a cohort-based training program working in communities across the state to provide training that is directly relevant to communities' interests. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about briefly about what that program is, so you have some context on kind of my experience and where this is coming from, and then also going to give a little bit of an overview, similar to how Katie did on the infrastructure side, about what it looks like on the ground for people who are running utilities. Hopefully, maybe provide some context for folks that might not be familiar with what it's like out there. So as I mentioned, the program I work on is called People in Power, and it's a cohort-based training program. We have 15 communities that we work with across 2 cohorts. On the map there, the communities in red are from our first cohort, and the communities in yellow are our second cohort that we're just starting to work with. And all the communities that I work with are independent standalone utilities, so they're not members of any multi-community co-ops. And for cohort 2, we're especially focused on communities that are also not members of any sort of larger organization like Tanana Chiefs Conference that provides direct infrastructure support. So trying to zero in even more on the communities that are truly, going it alone for the most part, aside from the partners that they may be working on, like folks at IES that provide engineering support through those contracted relationships. And the People in Power program, the unique thing about it is that my job is to work with communities to figure out what sort of training would be most helpful for them. And I've got buckets of money in certain occupational categories to spend on those particular trainings, and the time to coordinate it and make it happen and try to orchestrate trainings that are good bang for the buck for communities and meet their needs where they're at. So it's a really great opportunity to be able to work directly with communities and say yes to a lot of things, which feels great to be able to do. To meet those needs. And across those 15 communities, there's roughly 70 or so electric utility staff, folks that work directly with the electric utility, typically about 3 to 5 people per community on average, although some are a little bit larger that have more robust staff. And in addition to those electric utility staff, I also work with the governance boards. So that would be the tribal council or the city council or the co-op utility board or the local tribal or the local corporation board that have a role in the long-term goal setting and budgeting and forward-thinking oversight of the utilities. And so we work with all of those folks in addition to the management staff, the clerical staff, and the operations staff. And the intent of our training program and the work that we do is to support all of those folks from the highest level to the operators that are turning wrenches in the plant to be able to meet their needs for training to help them better run the utilities and better support their communities. And the communities we work with are across a range of geographies, a range of levels of staffing and economic resources, as well as the condition of their infrastructure and where they get energy from, and also across a broad range of engagement with outside partners. So some of the communities we work with have large renewable systems, like going diesels off in the summer. Some communities have no renewables at all and are working towards the sustainable operations that they need as a basis before they can do any of that sort of work. And just to give folks an idea of what a typical utility staff looks like, at a larger utility, communities like Galena that are a little larger, that have some more resources, you might have someone who's like a general manager or an administrator who is either running the whole overarching organization like the city that runs the utility, and maybe managing the staff at a higher level. And then you'll have a utility manager whose job it is to run kind of the day-to-day operations of the utility, making sure that operators turn in their reports, making sure that parts get ordered, making sure that reports are getting filed, that sort of thing, and often in many cases doing a lot of that paperwork themselves. And communities will often have 1 to 2 clerks. Typically, there's a clerk that's focused on billing or some of the lower level tasks, and a clerk that's more in depth on things like the QuickBooks accounting and filing reports. And then most communities, if they're lucky, will have potentially 2 to 6 operators. A lot of communities will have operators that work 1 week on, 1 week off, or 2 weeks on or 2 weeks off. And one of the things that is true about a lot of utilities is there's a pretty broad range in how they staff, how many hours the operators get, what they get paid. And so that is one thing that we've seen in our work, that there's a broad range of kind of levels of staffing, and definitely some trends in terms of more higher paid operators with more hours typically have more time available to dedicate to the plant. But as we know, that adds costs and that adds some difficulty as well. And then typically, if a community is lucky, they've got some dedicated folks who are really engaged on the governance side, things like a member of the city council who's taken an interest in energy issues and kind of taken on that role as an energy champion for their community, and is working projects towards completion. Last week I was at an Akiachek, and it was really cool to talk to folks who had been working towards, they have a large solar facility there with a battery energy storage that they developed with IES. And that's the thing that's been in the works for years and years and years. Some folks who kind of worked on that at the very early stages are now retired, and it's a really big thing for the community to get these big projects to fruition. And a lot of people are involved who are dedicating their time as volunteers supporting the community. And on the other side of the scale, a lot of smaller utilities might only have 1 to 2 operators, if that, and maybe only 1 person dedicated to the administrative side of things. So some smaller communities just have 1 person whose job it is to be the manager, the clerk, do the billing, do the reporting, make sure the operators are supported, doing everything you can imagine for the utility on the business side, all on 1 person's shoulders. And often that 1 person also is responsible for water sewer systems or the city finances. And it's a lot to put on just 1 person. And there's a lot of people that are doing really great work to support their communities, but it's a really big job. And then a lot of communities will have potentially a sub clerk or somebody who can step in. And similar with the operators, they'll have 1 primary operator who is really dedicated to that role, and maybe 1 person who can step in if those folks have to go out of town. So, as Katie mentioned, the level of infrastructure and the level of work that's required to run a utility is it's in a lot of ways pretty similar to in a 30-person community as it is to a 3,000-person community, but it's a lot to ask for a lot smaller number of people. And these are things that every utility has in common. In every community, the power utility is keeping the light on and the heat on for the community. And that has huge impacts. It's keeping freezers full, freezers cold, the subsistence foods to sustain people through the year. It's lights for the runway so planes can get in and out. It's the contact with the outside world, the telecommunications that allow people to be able to communicate with the outside world is all reliant on the power utility. It's running the water plant, the schools, the essential businesses, and also providing the storage and the sales of heating oil and gasoline that people rely on to keep their homes warm. It's an enormous responsibility that often falls on the shoulders of just a few folks. And so all of the work that community partners are doing across the state, the technical system providers and funders is a huge support, and every little bit counts for these communities. And every community has several $1 million in assets. Even these small communities have bulk fuel facilities that are in the hundreds of thousands of gallons, and have generators that maybe the generators themselves are smaller, but you still have a powerhouse and you still have the same number of 3 to 4 generators in every community. And oftentimes those generators are requiring tens of thousands of work regularly, spread out every year for rebuilds. And they're requiring oil changes every 250 hours and plant check-ins 4 times a day. And so it's a really enormous responsibility to fall on really small communities, in addition to the distribution systems and all of that. And as I mentioned earlier, there's also complex administrative responsibilities. And something that's really consistent across most communities is that folks are often thrown into a role with little training. Maybe they happen to be in the community when somebody retires or somebody gets sick and they have to leave the role. And folks step up to serve their communities in that way without a ton of preparation. So that's another reason why the support that communities get from outside folks and the training that they are providing is really, really important. And moving on to a little bit of kind of overview of some of the work that we've done. Some of the things that I wanted to highlight are through our training work, we've really tried to work within regions. So having folks who have skills within the regions serve the other folks in the region. So we trained a manager in Levelock who then went on to train other communities in the region because she had the time and the availability to be able to share those skills and provide that value to her community members and nearby communities. And so really trying to think about the ways that we can get the best bang for our buck, doing remote training or group training to be able to stretch training dollars further. And just wanted to highlight for folks, there's a training inventory that has resources and contacts for training. We've just rolled it out on our website, so we're working on getting more things added there. But this QR code will take you there if you want to scan it, bookmark it, maybe check back in on it in a few weeks. We'll hopefully have a lot more added in there. And also wanted to highlight, if you are working in any communities that do this type of work or could use some additional training, there's a deadline on the end of this week to apply for free administrative training for fuel systems that is run by the Rural Administrative Fuel Advisors Program, and also Aruba QuickBooks training coming up as well. Those are both free trainings. And more information is at that QR code as well on those. And that's all I had. Wanted to turn it over to questions.
Thank you, Jacob. I have a few questions and then I'm going to hand the floor back to Dominique, but I really appreciate your perspective from working so much with folks in the communities, like doing the work. So my first question, given your work with communities pretty much every day, can you tell us one reality about running or funding rural energy systems that you wish other people would better understand?
Yeah, I think I definitely spoke to it in the presentation, but I think just really highlighting the level of responsibility and the pressure that folks are under with these jobs, and they're often working alone without a lot of outside support. And I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind when thinking about when you see things like deferred maintenance happening or things falling through the cracks, is remembering that there's maybe 1 or 2 people maintaining these pretty complex systems, and it's a lot of responsibility and a lot of stress that folks are under. That can lead to issues like folks getting burned out or quitting abruptly or having to leave the community. Yeah, that's just it's enormous responsibility for folks that are often thrust into the role and stepping up to serve their communities, and it's really deserving of a lot of recognition and support.
Another question. We've talked about how solutions that might work in hub communities, larger, larger populations, higher capacity, don't always translate easily to the smaller villages. Can you give some examples that might stand out to you that could help illustrate those differences between hub and village and the different types of solutions that might work better in one or the other?
Mhm. Yeah, I think a big thing to highlight is for a lot of smaller communities, because they're maintaining a similar level of infrastructure to these larger communities, it's a lot more bringing on these big projects or coordinating like a big renewables project or changes to operations or overhauling the way that things are done is a pretty big lift for a lot of communities. And so it's just a numbers game, and I think that's something that Chris McConnell, AEA, would often talk about. That I think is a really great example of if you have a community that's say 100 people or 60 people, how many of those 100 or 60 people in that range are of working age, and of those working age folks, how many of them have available time and energy, and of those folks, how many have the skills to be able to do these things, and you start to whittle down to a really small pool of people that are able to fill these roles, and I think it just makes it really clear how some of these challenges are just, as you said, really structural to the communities and really require a lot of support to get people into a place where they're able to manage these things more sustainably.
In thinking about solutions that might work for a smaller village or hub or any rural community, if you could identify one or two of the most impactful opportunities for change, whether through policy, funding, better coordination, improved training, whatever, what would they be? What do you see as as offering the greatest potential for scalable, sustainable improvements in the near term or in the long term?
Yeah, I think one thing that has been really exciting and good to see is the development of more regional-based support. I think right around when I started, there was first started the rumblings of the Lake and Penn Utility Regional Support Collaborative that we'll hear more about later in the workshop, and that's finally coming to fruition. They're hiring someone to do that work, and that level of like regional support that's centralized is really huge because having one people or multiple people who are thinking kind of bigger picture and longer term about these systems that aren't necessarily tied up in the day-to-day of keeping the lights on, but are able to be really invested in helping support these communities is really huge. And I think something that offers a really big return on the investment of that staff time. And the way I've been thinking about it is, if you have somebody that's hired at the regional level to support these communities at a regional corporation or the borough level or something like that, all it takes is for that person to avert one or two emergencies or emergency rebuilds or a power outage to really make that person's salary worth it for the communities. And just the total amount of wealth in the community that's drained from emergencies like that is really easy to offset with some good support from folks. And I think we're also getting to the point where the solutions, we're starting to dial in some solutions and be able to have communities look to each other for advice on how to do things. There's been some communities that have been onboarding IPPs to be able to run their utilities in a different business model, and they're able to turn to other communities and say, hey, how did you do it? Could you share your documents, that sort of thing?
Hi, Katie. I would just like to break in for the last 3 minutes with a couple of audience questions.
Okay.
One question for you was that, did you mean billions? The slide indicated millions for the needs, or was that the annual highest need? And I think that's in reference to the funding gap.
The funding gap, the funding gap is somewhere north of about 1.5 billion. Nobody knows for sure exactly what that number is. It's really big. I think that's the really important takeaway. And roughly, somewhere more than 1 billion for tank farms and somewhere around 500 million for powerhouses. The numbers are just estimates. We don't know exactly. Is that the question? Whoever asked that question, did I give you the answer you were looking for?
That was me. And I just noticed that your slide had M's for millions, and since we have some folks who may not be familiar with the landscape, I just thought it was important to emphasize that yes, we really mean billions of dollars of need.
Yes. And the governor said it as well in his opening remarks. It's a lot of money and more than we can see coming this way at this moment in time, at least.
Okay, we only have a couple minutes left. I'd like to get in at least one more question with reference to the damage to the bulk fuel tanks. Matthew asked, were these facilities designed with low probability, high risk floods in mind?
I am going to punt that question because the Denali Commission is a funder, and it really depends. I hate to give that answer, but it really depends. It's a facility by a facility project, and flood risk today is probably a little different than flood risk 25 years ago, and the way facilities are designed have evolved since the commission was first a funder 25 years ago. That would be a great question to make sure is in writing so we can make sure somebody, probably from Alaska Energy Authority, I don't want to put anyone's back up against a wall, but I see Tim Sandstrom smiling right now, can respond with a better answer.
Okay, there are a couple more questions in the chat that we haven't had a chance to get to. Hopefully, people will be able to answer, the panelists will be able to answer those, but we do need to move on to our next panel, which is PCE 101, How Does It Work? Thank you so much to Katie and Jade for that incredible start to our workshop. Next up, I am pleased to introduce the presentation that I just mentioned, the PCE 101. During the next 45 minutes, we'll be hearing from Michael Ravato, Deputy Director of the Alaska Power Association, Tim Sandstrom, Chief Operating Officer of the Alaska Energy Authority, and Steve Colt, Research Professor for the Alaska Center for Energy and Power. To start the conversation, please join me in welcoming Michael to the stage. At the Alaska Power Association, the statewide trade association for the electric utilities in Alaska, Michael works closely with APA's member electric utilities to implement an effective government relations program and to help advance the goals of APA's members. Before coming to the APA, Michael spent 4 years as the Chief of Staff in the Alaska Senate and 2 years as a legislative liaison for the Knik Arm Crossing Project. He began his career in Alaska as a reporter at the Mat-Su Valley Frontiersman. He is a registered lobbyist in Alaska and carries the professional designation of a certified cooperative communicator from the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks, Dominique. Appreciate that introduction. Well, thanks. So as Dominique said, my name is Michael Ravato. I'm the Deputy Director of Alaska Power Association, and I know that Dominique gave a brief introduction, but I'll be very brief to say that we are the statewide trade association for electric utilities in Alaska. Many other states have cooperative associations. However, ours is a little bit more broad. Mostly in the Lower 8, you'll see, like the Washington Rural Electric Cooperative Association. APA actually has investor-owned utilities and municipal utilities along with cooperatives in our organization and a joint action agency in SEPA down there in Ketchikan. And so we have a bit broader of a membership, but our members all do the same thing, whether they're an IOU, a co-op, or a muni, and that's provide safe, reliable, affordable power across the state. And so I was asked to talk about the legislative history of power cost equalization, and I will attempt to do so in 10 minutes. But first, we're going to go back in time before we get to PCE and talk about the 1980s. So Alaska became a state in 1959, and kind of, the population started growing. There was other things that happened in the state that influenced, how the state's operations were going or what kind of the investment was. But in the 80s, there was a lot of transformation through hydropower and transmission and then PCE eventually. So you see on this slide, and I won't read all of it because I know everyone on here can read, but there was a lot of investment in hydropower, especially as the price of oil went significantly high. And we all know about price fluctuations nowadays with oil. But the state was really looking into how it could help to alleviate some of those costs through investment in power projects in various areas of the state. And so you'll see there's a lot of grants and loans that happen. There's a lot of co-op forming back in those days too. AVEC became in the early 80s, AVEC started, and so there was a lot of kind of people coming together to form these electric cooperatives. But importantly, there was this renaissance in hydropower, and so you had the Four Dam Pool project in the early 80s. You can see there the state constructed these 4 large-scale hydro projects that have now been the state has sold those off to various utilities, and of course there's Bradley Lake down in across from Homer, which the state still owns. And so there was a lot of investment in these big hydro projects, big impactful hydro projects in various parts of the state. And there was also a lot of investment in transmission. And you'll see the Alaska Intertie was constructed in the 80s with state appropriations, so state funded. And you see some information about this on the slide here. But one thing that the state seemed to realize back then was there wasn't really a silver bullet necessarily for rural electric cost, and there was all this investment in the rail belt and in these big hydro projects, and there wasn't a way, I guess, a conceivable or a streamlined way to do this all over rural Alaska and bring those costs down. And so the legislature kind of birthed power cost equalization, so to speak. So in 1980, it was the Power Production Cost Assistance Program. It was a 1-year stopgap, right? And then in 81, the legislature amended this to the Power Cost Assistance Program. And as you see, it was designed to self-extinguish in 5 years. But the legislature in 1984, the Alaska legislature, they realized that there was no one answer to bring affordable power across rural Alaska, at least back in the 80s with what they were looking at. And then they also realized is that bullet, that third, not really bullet, but that third paragraph says there was lots and lots of money that had been committed all over urban Alaska and other places to reduce power costs and make hydropower more accessible. But there is just, as we all know here in Alaska, vast area in rural Alaska and many, many, many communities that are isolated out there. And there was really no way that the state figured they could spend the money to build projects that would bring the power down, commiserate to what was happening in urban Alaska. So power cost equalization came out of that. The PCA was rewritten essentially as PCE in October 1984, or if it became effective in 1984 in October. You can see some information there about kind of the stats when this came into being. Importantly, initially, all of the users were eligible. The PCE applied to the first 750 kilowatt hours used. That was changed in 2000. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but that was changed in the year 2000 to 500 kilowatt hours. And so, for instance, if you're a residential customer, your first 500 kilowatt hours was subsidized by power cost equalization. Anything over 500 kilowatt hours in a month was full fare, essentially, not stabilized. And that was done to address cost concerns. And we'll talk a little bit about this because now in recent history, that's flipped back. And so that's where it started. Back in the 80s, the legislature realized that there wasn't really one way they're going to solve with construction money, so to speak, the cost of power in rural Alaska. So they created PCE. You're going to hear from the other speakers about the workings of PCE. I'm not going to get into the actual workings necessarily. There's better experts on this call that can do that. One thing you'll hear when you talk to longtime utility folks who live in areas that receive PCE is that for a long time after PCE's creation, it was essentially general fund appropriations that went to fund the program every single year. And so there were some years where you weren't sure if the power cost equalization program would become fully funded. And that uncertainty is not very good for communities. Everyone on this call knows that certainty is kind of like the bread and the butter of life. Everyone likes to know what's going to happen or know that something's going to be there. And in the absence of that, you get great uncertainty. And this was realized by the legislature, and they created the Power Cost Equalization Endowment Fund, and they capitalized this. So this is the year 2000 was when it was created. It was initially capitalized with $100 million from the Constitutional Budget Reserve. Boy, that's a lot of money coming out of the CBR and hydroelectric dam sales. The fund has grown quite a bit over the years. It topped $1 billion in 2018. I think as of today, I think it sits like right near $1 billion. I think it might be slightly lower than $1 billion, but it's definitely like close to $1 billion. I think it fell out of the 3 Comma Club a little bit ago, but it's It's right there, I believe. And then I'll talk about that last bullet point a little bit later. So the important legislative aspect of creating the Power Cost Equalization Endowment Fund was a steady stream of funding that relieved the pressure off the general fund. And so now, if things work in the normal course of how they should work, the legislature takes the earnings off the PCE endowment and funds the PCE program with that money every year. And that gives a little bit more certainty, although we know anything can happen. I'm knocking on the wood of my desk here. Gives a little bit more certainty to communities that funding for the PCE program will be there each year. So in my mind, I'll freelance here. That was a genius creation by the legislature to create an endowment that could spin off money that would fund the PCE program through the future years without having to rely on that somewhat unreliable, so to speak, funding that can come out of the general fund, which then competes for other funding with other programs of the state and other items throughout the years. There was some recent history that further bolstered the certainty around the PCE Endowment Fund, which was for 3 years, starting in 2019, the PCE Endowment Fund was actually swept back into the Constitutional Budget Reserve. And so there's a process at the end of every fiscal year where some funds of the state, unless the legislature votes with a 3/4 supermajority vote to reverse this, they're swept into the CBR. And this is because the state constitution disallows dedicated funds. So these, off the top of my head, I don't have every single funding source that will go back. There are many. There's something called a sweep and then a reverse sweep. And up until 2019, the reverse sweep was kind of a formality that the legislature did. Even those legislators who voted against the budgets would typically vote for the reverse sweep so that these programs that had money dedicated to them could continue to run and not be swept into the CBR. However, in these 3 years listed on this slide, there was some disagreement over the budget, vast disagreements over the budget, and these funds were swept from the PCE Endowment Fund into the CBR, making them unavailable essentially to the PCE program. And we did have about 1 month, I think it was in 2020, I want to say, although I could have gotten my years wrong on which year this was. There was about 1 month where the PCE program was unfunded because of this sweep did not occur. However, there was a legal challenge brought in 2021 by a group of organizations, the Alaska Federation of Natives, Alaska Village Electric Cooperative, an APA member of ours, and other rural stakeholders that sued, and they argued that the PCE Endowment Fund was not one of these funds that was eligible to be swept. And the court agreed with them. The court said, "You're right. We think that the PCE endowment is not one of these funds. It's a separate fund of a public corporation." And the court said this fund, the PCE endowment, is not a sweepable fund if you want to put it in legislative parlance. And so that was a big win for the endowment, and again increasing that certainty that it would be there. And so now that's one less thing we have to worry about when it comes to the end of session. However, I put this slide in here, but the court also said, even though the PCE endowment fund can't be swept, it can be legally appropriated for any public purpose. And so one aspect during the legislative session that that communities or people who are have an interest in PCE will pay attention to is that that almost $1 billion endowment fund is not appropriated to other purposes that don't align with what its statute says. And, we have seen some draft versions of budgets in the past that has proposed taking money out of the PCE endowment for maybe to fund prisons or to fund other aspects. And the fear of that amongst the PCE communities is if that is allowed to happen and money is appropriated from the endowment to other non-PCE purposes, that it will start kind of a trend, and then that fund will get depleted, maybe not all the way, but still enough that it would impact the investment of the fund and then the earnings that spin off from it. And so it's an important thing to keep in mind. I mentioned here a note, APA at my organization does have a state policy position that the PCE endowment only be used for its statutory purpose, which is laid out in statute with some caveats that I'll talk about a little bit. So important to know if you leave this presentation with anything is that the fund can't be swept, but it can be appropriated for any public purpose. And so that's an important thing to understand. Okay, so one thing I was asked to talk about was recent legislative changes. And in recent, I think this is the last few years here, last 5 or so years, maybe fast 2016. All right, maybe last 10 or so years. Senate Bill 196 was a bill that was enacted in 2016. And what it did is it managed the excess earnings from the PC Endowment Fund. And so, as I mentioned, and as you probably gather from this presentation, the endowment is a fund that's invested in with the hopes of getting a return to spin off earnings so that it can fund the PC program and now other things as well. And there was a course of many years there where the endowment was spinning off a great number of funds, well in excess of the, at the time, $32 million roughly it took every year to fund the PCE program. So the legislature passed the bill, SB 196 in 2016, that introduced a waterfall mechanism that delineated how this excess revenue can be spent and what it can be spent on by the legislature. And so we'll talk about that actually in the next slide here. It's important to note, first of all, that one legislature cannot bind a future legislature. And so oftentimes in statute, you'll see the word may instead of shall when it comes to spending. And so this statute is not demanding or requiring the legislature to appropriate money this way. It's allowing the legislature to do so. And typically the legislature has followed this, but they do have discretion in it. And so I kind of pulled this on what you see in the slide directly from the statute. So first, the PC program has to be fully funded, right? And nowadays, and we'll talk about this in a second, nowadays it's about $48 million to fully fund the PC program every single fiscal year. So if there is excess earnings beyond what that cost is to fund the PC program, if it's less than $30 million, that amount can go to community revenue sharing or community assistance fund. And you'll see that, the amount kind of depends on how the excess earnings do. If it's more than $30 million in excess, $30 million goes to the community revenue sharing or assistance fund. And then the remaining amount of that excess, not to exceed 25 million, goes to what's laid out there. The Renewable Energy Grant Fund, an extremely important, very workable, very great program of the state that does a lot of good. It can go to that program, the Bulk Fuel Revolving Loan Fund, or you see these other items on there that can be funded through these excess earnings. I think in recent history, the excess earnings has not been sufficient enough to fund all these items, but we have definitely seen in recent past some excess earnings that has gone to community assistance, which is helpful to various communities out there. Another change in 2022, SB 243 raised that residential PCE cap back up to 750 kilowatt hours, restoring the original 1984 support levels. I mentioned the difference in funding. So under the 500 kilowatt hour cap, it was about $32 million per year to fund. With the increase of 750 kilowatt hours, that has increased the annual appropriation to about $48 million. And so while there is some more room for residential customers to receive subsidies for their electricity use under that 750 kilowatt hour increase cap, it is putting a little bit more pressure on the endowment earnings to fund that higher level of funds. I will say, just from what I know, though, it varies amongst people. Many rural Alaska customers have figured out energy efficiency, and they do a great job of keeping their monthly usage down out there. Finally, I'm nearly through this. Fiduciary responsibility. So in 2023, the legislature passed the bill SB 98 that shifted the management of the PC endowment from the Department of Revenue over to the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation. At that time, legislators felt the permanent fund folks were better able to manage and grow the PC endowment. And I wish I had some empirical evidence in front of me of whether or not that panned out. However, I don't. Maybe one of the other gentlemen talking after me will know this, but there was a lot of discussion in the legislature that year about how DOR was handling the investment of this endowment, and really the recognizing that this program is so important to rural Alaska and that it's going to be needed for the foreseeable future, even as rural electric utilities continue to integrate different generation diversity and other technologies to hold down their cost of power, or hopefully bring down the cost of power. PC is really the financial infrastructure out there in rural Alaska often. So lawmakers wanted to ensure that this fund performed as best as it could, and they felt the permanent fund was the best place to do that. That's it. I'm not going to take questions now. We'll wait till the end, but I appreciate the opportunity to do some of the legislative history on PCE. Thanks.
Steve has been studying Alaska's energy challenges since coming to Alaska in 1984. He is trained as an economist, and he worked at the Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of Alaska Anchorage for 30 years. And now he helps out at the Alaska Center for Energy and Power at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Thank you so much, Steve.
So I have just really a couple of points that I'd like to try to get to. And in particular, I hope to try to spur some conversation here. And I'm largely channeling thinking and doing that's been done by others. Dominique is a thought leader in what I'm about to talk about, and some others have tried some new ideas with some action. Just one little take on what the program is. Just one thing that I want to point out here really quickly is that PCE is a tailored program, and it has stood the test of time and done a fantastic job, but it is a focused and tailored program. It focuses on residents. It doesn't directly help businesses. It focuses on electricity. It doesn't directly address heat, although that's changing. And as Michael has pointed out, it uses money as the vehicle to reduce people's electricity rates. So it's really a very particular program, and I'm going to reemphasize an aspect of that a little later on. Skipping stuff that you've already seen or will already see. And I'm skipping this slide, but this is a preview of one of my main points, is that PCE really does not help everybody. It is tailored, and it is somewhat narrower than you might think. All right, here's the first thing that I want to not necessarily emphasize, but just slow down and share with you. This is a graphic of how it actually works. And it is tied to this thing called the base rate, which is the average rate paid by people in Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Juneau, Alaska's large urban areas. And it's also tied to the eligible cost, which varies by utility. So the first step in the formula, you might say, is to say, well, what is my eligible cost? And I picked a round number that's representative of what these things actually are. So let's say it's 40 cents. You get the Regulatory Commission to approve that number. Then you plug in what's called the base rate, which is, again, I'm rounding the number for ease of exposition here, but it's now slightly above 20 cents. And that is also determined by the Regulatory Commission based on looking at the data for Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Juneau. So now we've got this gap between the utilities cost and the base rate. And then you apply the formula which says take 95% of the gap. And here I've rigged the numbers so we can actually do this. 5% of the gap is going to be 1 cent. So 95% is going to be 19 cents. And that's what PCE covers. Okay. So it's a gap filling program, but it only fills 95% of that gap. And I can't resist channeling my friend and colleague Gwen Holdman, who likes to keep reminding us that when the rail belt costs go up, it also negatively affects everyone in Alaska, because that base rate goes up and what PCE is going to cover as the gap goes down. So there are connections through this formula between what we do on the rail belt and what happens in the rest of Alaska. All right, moving right along. Oh, a reminder that after you apply PCE, it still leaves the user paying a significant amount of money. It's not just like a blanket handout. If we apply the formula or use an example with real data from Kotzebue in 2023, they actually have a cost, or it's actually their rate, but we can think of it as their approved cost. That is right around 40 cents. So they kind of fit the bill of what we just saw. And here's the thing that I really want to slow down and at least let you digest it. This is a little graphic showing all of the sales from left to right. That's the sort of length of the rectangle, is their sales of electricity in 2023. And the vertical axis shows the money. So the total cost, if you will, of providing all this electricity is the whole area of this rectangle, 40 cents a kilowatt hour times 19.6 million kilowatt hours of sales. I should have put the total on there, but you can figure that out. And the point of this graphic is to demonstrate something that I think gets lost in translation or lost in the shuffle quite often when we talk about PCE. And that is that the amount of energy that it actually covers, the amount of kilowatt hours that are so-called eligible for PCE, is actually quite small compared to the total. And it's the green. So on the residential side, you have a lot of residential kilowatt hours that exceed that 750 per month cap. And so those kilowatt hours are being paid at 40 cents. And everyone is paying the 21 cents. And over on the community facilities side in Kotzebue, most of their community facilities bill is eligible for PCE. I don't think that's true everywhere, but not all of it. And then here's the thing that I think is most often forgotten, is that there's this whole crowd of non-residential ratepayers, especially including people that are trying to run a small business, that don't get any help at all from PCE. So I'm not saying this is good or bad, but I think it's really important to remember that the majority, if not the vast majority, of energy that's being generated is being sold and paid for at the full rate. And so the incentives are still pretty strong to do something. In other words, PCE does not shield people from the reality of how expensive it is to generate electricity. All right, let me now move to the last point I'd like to make. And again, I'm really trying to tee up some discussion and some thinking, some conversation here. And that is an emerging challenge that the PCE program is confronting when enterprising communities and entrepreneurs try to take what has been known to some as excess wind power. And at ACEP, we like to call this otherwise curtailed energy. In other words, energy coming especially from wind that would not have a load to serve if you just considered the conventional electric loads. So some people have been installing thermal stoves to soak up this wind power when it becomes available and has no other place to go. And it's a really elegant way to try to use the wind and address the heating burden. So let's just do this little thought experiment, which will reveal the problem with PCE, and then I'll be done. Suppose we have a system that's got a bunch of existing sales, and then we add a bunch of kilowatt hours by hooking up thermal stoves. And we jigger the system so that the thermal stoves only take the wind when it is not needed for other loads. So if you run through the numbers, I'm not going to run through the numbers here, but you can look at the slide deck later if you're really interested. A kind of a weird thing happens, and it relates to the way the PCE formula works at the front end. And the front end is, what's your allowable cost per kilowatt hour? Well, the allowable cost per kilowatt hour is a I don't really want to say simple, but it's a very straightforward calculation where you take your total cost and you divide it by your total sales. That's written into I think it's written right into the statute or else the regs. So what happens when we add all these kilowatt hours from stoves? Well, they don't really cost much more because it's wind that has nowhere else to go, and the wind turbines are already in place. So all we're doing is we're adding kilowatt hours into the denominator of the formula. And if you then follow the path of the numbers, your eligible cost goes down, the base rate stays the same, and the gap that you're filling with PCE goes down, perhaps significantly, and the amount that you're going to get per kilowatt hour across the board can go way down. And this is the PCE formula. It applies to every kilowatt hour. And so it applies to all the people who are sort of innocent bystanders that don't have stoves. They're just paying their electric bill, and they could actually get walloped in this example with an increase in their rate that they actually pay from the 21 cents to 29 cents. Using this example. So let me finish by reiterating that, in the words of, I guess, Tom Hanks or whoever the actual astronaut was, Houston, we may have a problem here as we try to add kilowatt hours to the mix with thermal stoves and other things that use intermittent excess wind power. So this is recapitulating the problem, is that as you add energy into the system, you add energy into the denominator of your formula, and if nothing else happens, your PCE amount that's received by everybody is going to drop. And I'd like to call out and thank Connie Fredenberg for noticing this problem and also trying to fix it. By doing some workarounds, and she's largely been unsuccessful. But thank her for trying and for calling our attention to this problem some years ago. I won't dwell on this slide, but you can look at the deck. I put in data from an example that she provided from the real world, where this is a real problem. So to finish, again, my hope is to tee this up for some conversation. And, one thing that the conversation might lead to is actually changing the formula to take out those extra kilowatt hours from that denominator and sort of separate out the non-diesel side of the utilities operations from the diesel side. That's one idea, and there may be others. So I will stop there and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Steve, for your presentation. I would like to move into some audience questions. And let me scroll back here. We had one commenter say that their community used to have PCE, but no longer has it. And they were wondering if there was some way to get this back for people on a fixed income. I'm confused about, and then there was some confusion about whether the program still existed, but we know in fact that it does still exist. Perhaps this community was one of the ones where their power costs dropped low enough that they no longer were eligible to receive PCE, which in that case, that's a huge win for the community if your power costs are low enough that you don't. That means they're lower than the average cost in Fairbanks, Anchorage, and Juneau. But let's say that perhaps the community isn't receiving PCE because of the reporting requirements. Could somebody address, well, I guess our one presenter, unfortunately, we had a technical difficulty and our presenter from the Alaska Energy Authority cannot get back in. But do either of you, can you address what happens regarding the reporting requirements and how that would impact a community's ability to receive PCE?
Steve, do you know this? I mean, to me, if you're having a problem with PCE, or you should call Alaska Energy Authority as the administrator of it and discuss it with them. And maybe Steve has a better answer.
No, I think that would be my answer. They're very helpful and competent. They want to help, and so that's probably the best place to start. I'll leave it at that.
We have a comment that PCE covers a very low cost or a low percentage of energy costs. And the question is, would the money be better spent by investing in more energy efficient systems?
I'll take a shot at that one. It's very interesting, and Michael might have some insight into this, but it would be very interesting to go back in time and sort of poll the legislators who voted for this as to whether they were conceiving of it as a permanent program or some sort of bridge to a future where we didn't have so much dependence on diesel. And I bet it was a mixed bag, but the program has stood the test of time, right? It's now 40 years old. And at the same time, of course, we've tried to make inroads into the underlying problem of high cost diesel with vehicles like the Renewable Energy Fund. And so from my perspective, there's always been a tension and a conversation about whether we should maybe shift more funding away from the sort of year-to-year subsidy and toward more actual physical investment in getting off of diesel. And I would just finish this little comment by saying, by referring us all back to my red and green slide of the Kotzebue situation, where you can see that the overwhelming majority of those kilowatt hours are passing through the system at full price. And so the incentive to get off diesel is not being diluted, if you will, with the PCE money. And I think we have actually a good balance. If that was all green in my slide, I would then say, well, we should be shifting towards physical solutions and not just sending all this money out. But we really aren't sending that much money out in comparison to the total electric bill that these communities are having to pay.
Thank you. Our next question is, what would be your recommendation to improve or reform the PCE program to better support rural Alaska in the future?
I'll let Steve take this. I don't know if I have a recommendation from us.
My recommendation is to let Dominique amplify or maybe comment on the issue that I tried to raise about incorporating excess or otherwise curtailed wind into the system.
Okay, thank you. A follow-up question about the PCE reporting earlier. Marilyn wants to know, if the reporting was not accomplished and lost the PCE, what is the process to get it back?
I'm not sure what the process is. I mean, I would really recommend calling Alaska Energy Authority, and APA has had frequent meetings with them on PCE matters, and they have a great staff over there that is really tuned in on this stuff. And so I wish I had a contact I mean, Tim Sandstrom would be great. He's the chief operating officer to kind of send you the right direction, but they definitely have, I don't know, that's definitely an AEA question, because I think it depends on your specific situation. And I would just add one thing to that one of the previous questions about, investing in energy systems to lower the reliance on PCE. This is something APA hears from legislators quite often about what could we do, but there's also this like chicken and egg thing too, right? Because while this investment in energy systems that could lower the cost is happening, the costs are still high and they still need subsidization out there through PCE. And so, I'm not sure off the top of my head exactly how many, probably billions it would take to construct projects in rural Alaska, but I think the query or the quandary is, you have this program PC that's working well, but you have the desire to lower the cost. So the money has to come from somewhere to do that. And how do you do one first without the other? And so it's definitely a major funding and perhaps policy call on leadership.
Okay, thank you. Next question. What role do you think independent power producers can play in integrating renewable energy into rural systems without adversely affecting the power cost equalization?
Steve, you look like you're chomping at the bit for this one.
No, I'm hoping that you will take the bait first.
Well, I'm not sure. I couldn't comment on the future, but just to say that we've seen now instances in rural Alaska where in the IPPs are forming. The Shungnak example with AVEC is a good example that is really keeping the money in the community, right? Because the local community or the tribe or the native corporation is forming the IPP, and then that does address, the utility is not itself building the renewable energy systems that could then impact the PCE calculation. They're purchasing the power from an IPP. And so perhaps it is the wave of the future. I don't know. I don't know exactly. You're probably going to have speakers from rural utilities that could answer this better than I could. But we've definitely seen an interest in doing this in rural Alaska that seems to be working out there at this point. So I think it's all probably subjective and based on the community and in the circumstance that the utility finds itself in, especially since, as I understand it, some communities in Alaska are just, frankly, they're going to be on diesel, right? I mean, there is no way to fully get them off of diesel. And so I think it depends on where you are.
Welcome back. I'm excited to now introduce our next presentation, Regulatory Commission of Alaska, Regulation in Rural Alaska, presented by Stephen Jones, Consumer Information Officer 2 of the Regulatory Commission of Alaska. This presentation will provide a broad perspective on the RCA's responsibilities, economically regulated versus non-economically regulated utilities, staff procedures, and the biggest challenges facing rural utilities. Stephen and his family have spent most of their lives in Alaska. He's been at the Regulatory Commission for over 17 years. Prior to that, he spent approximately 20 years in customer service and banking, primarily in Anchorage. His education includes an MBA from the University of Alaska, Anchorage. Welcome, Stephen.
The Regulatory Commission of Alaska is one of many state agencies that assist the general public. And we are located at 701 West 8th Avenue, Suite 300 in Anchorage, but we service the entire state. We have a staff of about 50 with various sections, including common carrier, tariff, engineering, finance, and as well as administrative law judges to handle various issues. Our next slide is generally what the commission, I'll use the word commission interchangeably with the RCA. Under Alaska statutes 4204, 05, 06, 48, and 45, we have broad authority to regulate public utilities and pipeline carriers throughout the state. We have over 500 active certificates of public convenience and necessity, where a utility would need to register with us. We'd look to determine what managerial, technical, and financial abilities they have and determine if a certificate needs to be issued or if they might be exempt. We have a broad range of utility services: electric, natural gas, steam heat, refuse, sewer, and water. We oversee regulated utilities through certification process. We have a regulation of rates and services. We have a tariff review, which goes through our tariff section. We have a dispute resolution, which is handled by our consumer protection section for informal complaints. and the rest of the commission for alternative dispute resolution and formal complaints. And we determine the power cost support for eligible customers under the PCE program. And I know there's going to be an additional speaker that's going to be talking about the PCE. I believe the RCA approved the PCE amount as of July 1 to be 0.2038 kilowatts for the next fiscal year, which is July 1 of this year to June 30th of next year. Like I said, we currently oversee 500 active certificates, 134 of which are provision of electric service. And I believe 34 of those are fully regulated services. Economically regulated utilities have a tariff, and the tariff includes their service area, their rates, their services, pricing, terms and conditions, and they cannot change those terms without prior commission approval. Non-economically regulated or utilities exempt from economic regulation, which are not required to file a tariff, do not have oversight. They have different forms of exemption. The most common one that you see is a political subdivision of the state, meaning, for example, the city of Seward. Any city that operates a utility has its own ordinances, board of directors, different ways of handling things through assembly and so on, that is not covered by a tariff. So if they should contact the regulatory commission, what we do is we ask them to contact the local city so that they have, because they have jurisdiction over their own processes and rates and services and so on. That's usually the first step. Again, 34 electric are economically regulated. The ones that are not economically regulated set their own rates, terms, conditions. If they receive power cost equalization support, and if that term is maybe new to some people, but what they do is they look at the rates that Juneau, Anchorage, and Fairbanks set for the electric power, and they then look at rural Alaska to help offset some of the cost of that. And with that, it basically offsets up to 750 kilowatts of the power. And there's a rate, like I said, that's been recently established starting July 1. The role of the commission, as with most state agencies, balance the needs of the ratepayers, or in this case, the public, with those of the utilities, first determining if a utility is fit, willing, and able to provide a service for convenience or necessity of the public. And the first thing they do when a utility applies is they look at the management, the technical and financial aspects to determine, is the utility fit, willing, and able to do that? And there is a process that they go through. And oftentimes, people will want to acquire a utility and they have to provide that they're able to actually meet these criteria. We also make sure that there's not non-discriminatory utility services at just and reasonable rates. And that means that you have to weigh what the customer is paying versus keeping the utility with a certain amount of growth or allowing it to grow. If you don't allow the utility to anticipate the future, then who's going to provide that services should they go under? That's one of the big things is oftentimes a community will only have one power company, or in this case, and they will look at it and go, okay, what rates do we balance with keeping this thing going? And oftentimes they'll have to turn to alternate sources for maybe improving the infrastructure or whatnot, because the customer base may not be able to justify, putting a large amount on a small amount of people. So they have to seek alternative sources. Again, with utilities that contact us, oftentimes, and I've spent some time in Dillingham and Ketchikan, as well as visited Sitka and Bethel and so on. But there's a different mentality that most of the people don't understand, is that oftentimes you don't have the expertise that's 24/7 that you would have at a lot of places. They get to that and they say, okay, what can we do to help somebody that may not have the expertise or whatnot? So the commission has staff that work with them either in financial aspects or technical any types of tariffs, questions they may have on how to file, how to meet certain things, and then communicating with some utilities via fax, or even if their filing is not the most current up to date, at least they're getting their filing done. And so some of the utilities will file quarterly, some will file every 6 months. It depends on what they're filing. Sometimes there'll be a cost of power adjustment where the fuel amounts have changed, and so they need to change their pricing, or they may do a cost of service study or a revenue requirement to say, okay, overall our prices need to go up because of this. And we look at that and we determine, is it going to be something that is going to be a permanent increase, or do we need some time to review it? So oftentimes you'll see this term that's interim and refundable. That means the commission will allow a certain amount of interim rate while it's looking at it, and that money's put aside in a certain account. If the utilities found that it's not needed, then it's refunded back to the customer or percentage thereof. So you might see that that the commission has to take those into review, some of which can take up to 2 years. This is one of the issues that, as a public service, as a public media person, I firsthand knowledge of this one. This was, as most people know, the Antioch rate situation in 2023. And the background story basically is that the small amount of customers, as we were indicated, had a large increase that the utility wanted to do, and trying to figure out how to keep the utility afloat and how to, in essence, get that money paid back without putting an undue burden on the customers and what process they went through. So what the commission did is they looked at their internal controls, training methods, and implemented a 20% residential bill impact threshold for cost of power increases. Again, the cost of power increase is the fuel, and it's oftentimes a pass-through of what the invoices were that consisted of the cost of power increase, and issuing a public notice and requiring direct notice to customers of all proposed increase that will result in a bill more than 20%. And we did, like I said, I was one of the first line people that answered that. We don't take this responsibility lightly, and we're trying to make sure that this situation doesn't occur again. And one of the regulations that, if anyone is wanting to basically get some reading material, the cost of power increase is in the Alaska Administrative Code, 3 AAC 52501 to 52519. And that's one of the, it'll spell out all how cost of power is calculated, how notices are issued, and so on and so forth. So again, if you wanted some light reading, certainly encourage that. The biggest challenges that I found is I've gone to a couple of AFNs and other things doing outreach, and oftentimes the community will get a grant for, like say, for example, wind turbines, and the ongoing maintenance and the ongoing responsibility of repairs wasn't necessarily something that they'd anticipated. It may break down, but how do you get more monies to get more repairs or more training? So the aging plant causing inefficiency or mechanical failures or outage, that very much ties with the wind turbine that I was thinking about, is that it's great if, as long as it continues to be the alternative to diesel fuel or other things to get it more efficient. The other is staffing issues relating to meter readings. We've had people have to go out on snow machines and read the meters. Sometimes they will change from a turtle meter to a more efficient meter. A turtle meter basically was a meter that transmitted the electric reading every 8 hours. It took 8 hours to get your monthly reading out to the utility over the line. Nowadays, there are ones that do it every 15 minutes. And so technology's evolved, but there's still the issue of large geographic differences that Alaska faces that most states don't. And then again, the filing requirements continually are being looked at and bringing everyone up to speed as to which is the latest methods. Additional resources that we will often turn people to if they have questions is, and again, there may be some other presentators that have this information, but there's the DCRA, there's RUBA, there's oftentimes 211. If it's an individual person that needed assistance, our consumer protection section often will refer them to the 211. And depending on the level of disaster, there may be FEMA or others. Certainly additional speakers have more detail on that particular part. The Regulatory Commission holds public meetings, and usually the first part of every meeting, we allow people up to 5 minutes to talk about comments, even if it's not related to the topic of the day. And we also post things that the commission is doing, as well as if there's a tariff filing or there's some other filing that there's an open comment period for, then people can file comments online with us. And in addition, on our website, which is rca.mayalaska.gov, there is in the corner, it'll say what comments have already been submitted. So you can get an idea of what's out there, what you can comment on, and what other people have said, as well as any relative news. The biggest news on our website is the Administrative Order 360 that came from Governor Dunleavy. And we talk about people commenting on the regulations, the goal being reduction of 15% regulatory burden first year and 25% reduction by the second year. So we have a range of the administrative code that we operate under, and we ask for public comment for each of those ranges so that we can see what we can improve, what can reduce, and so on. That was the end of my presentation. Did anyone have any questions?
We have one question so far. What if Alaska started universal service fund type for village utilities? Or excuse me, universal service fund type for village utilities. I don't know what a universal service fund is.
Okay, am I still? Okay,
Yes.
I still audio. There's a number of federal programs as well as state programs. So the Universal Service Fund, the ACS, there's a number of form. I'd have to check to see what that particular person, if they could email me, I could get more specific as to what they're looking for. The program's already out there, but there may be some requirements for that particular place that I'm not aware of. But I could certainly get that our telecom section to answer that question for us. My email address is Steven, that's STEVEN .JONES at ALASKA.gov.
All righty, we don't have any more audience questions at this time. This is your chance, everybody. We have somebody from the RCA here with us. All righty. Could you explain RAPA's role with the RCA?
Oh, RAPA and background story used to be part of the RCA, and RAPA is Regional Affairs and Public Advocacy, and they represent the public interest. That now falls under the Department of Law, although they're located in the same building as we are. And what they do is they look at each concern, filing, and so on that takes place to determine if they want to represent the public interest in that, provide another side of it, if you will. And they have experts that look at each of those and say, okay, what about this? Or we believe it's best served if we did this. And so they have a staff of about 8, I believe, here locally, but it falls under Department of Law to represent the public interest.
Okay, thank you. We have an additional question. The USF money comes in from, this is actually not a question. It's a message from Steve Colt. He said the Universal Service Fund money comes in from surcharges on phone bills across the country. Lower 48 money coming into Alaska, just like Essential Air Service paying for 3 jets a day into Sitka. Bill Stam asked, Stephen, you mentioned the continuing maintenance cost of wind or other renewables. In calculating PCE wind and other renewables can drastically reduce diesel use and the cost of power, COPA. However, the cost for maintaining renewables is not allowed as a cost of power and adversely affects the PCE benefits for renewables. Do you see how this might be fixed in RCA regulation?
Well, that is interesting because the regulatory review that we're doing now, there is sections on things that this particular person may want to comment on and provide their own take on that. I could see how the commission would need to review that, particularly as new technology evolves. For example, when we had years ago when Juneau was relying on hydro and the connections went down, then they had to switch to diesel, which is 5 to 6 times more expensive. So how do we calculate the cost? How do we do all that? I mean, that's an ideal question to pose regulatory change or review under this Administrative Order 360 that we're doing now. If he wants to file a comment, it is right on the website as to what he suggests. If there's a method that he suggests or thinks there's a better way to do that. I don't know the answer to that. The regulations on our website basically are all of the administrative codes that the Alaska USA, we operate under. And so I'm trying to find where we got this. It's basically 47 through 53, I believe. So all of the administrative code is listed on our website. You look under Alaska statutes and regs, you look under AO 360. Steve, does the RCA view AO as a chance to simplify regulations by the required percentage? That is one of the goals, is to not only simplify it, but actually reduce it. There may be some that are, the telecom section, for example, has taken dramatic deregulation. So a lot of those regulations may not be pertinent. So that's a chance for all of the agencies to look at every regulation they have. But yes.
I have a question. So earlier in the earlier presentation on power cost equalization, Steve Colt had brought up the situation where communities that are selling otherwise curtailed kilowatt hours are getting dinged in their PCE. Because it reduces, if you add all these excess kilowatt hours into the denominator, but the community selling them at a rate that is below the eligible rate for PCE, so the revenue is lower, and then you end up in a situation where the community's PCE level is reduced, even though the cost of serving their traditional loads is not reduced, if that makes sense. What is the process to change the PCE equation to remedy that, or just what is the process for changing the PCE equation at all? Not necessarily just for that, but could you walk us through what that would look like?
Let's see. The power cost equalization, there's a formula, like it's based on the 3 communities, Anchorage, Juneau, Fairbanks, and it's based on the electrical usage of those major utilities in those areas. There is a review by the commission, and it goes through formula, and then it is again an amount is established for a fiscal year. Find here. So yeah, on electric rates, to prepare new PCE calculations are 3 AAC 52640B. So any of the 52640 would be, I think, to answer your question, I'd have to look at those in detail.
Okay, so that is the section in which the code or the administrative code would have to be amended. But
right,
my question was more of getting to the point of how, let's say a community, any utility A was like, this is unfair. How would they go? How would they approach? What's the process for approaching the RCA and having their case heard, I guess, in order to, and then if the RCA went along with that, what would be the process for changing that? That was sort of where my question was going.
Okay. The PCE formula, because it's based in the Alaska Administrative Code, Alaska statutes, those types of things, mandated by the Alaska Statute 42.45. So a change in that formula process and whatnot would have to go through the Alaska legislative process. It's not set at our level.
Okay. All right, thank you. We have a question that asks, does the RCA have plans to provide access to PCE data in Excel or CVS format? At the moment, many different entities across the state are manually parsing data from the PDF reports, which is a fairly onerous and inaccurate process.
I'd have to get back to that person. I don't know if that's not been brought forth to me, but I can certainly check on that. I know that we're looking at options to basically set up new databases, but I don't know if there's any plans for that particular thing or not. They can certainly send me an email, and I can, I can see what's going on in terms of the RCA level about that.
Okay, excellent. And it sounds like somebody seconds that request. They said that they've tried to pull data with artificial intelligence and was unable to do that. So I think that that would be a great thing for you to do, to try to get back to our participants today on how they can get easier access to that data. We have a question: how many communities are using these curtailed loads? And so I think what they're saying is how many communities are using otherwise curtailed kilowatt hours to service dispatchable loads. Do you know the answer to that, Steve?
I do not know the answer to that.
Okay, I might be able to speak to this a little bit. I know that there are several communities in Western Alaska that are selling otherwise curtailed kilowatt hours for use with electric resistance or electric storage heaters. And then I believe there is at least one community that is doing this with hydro. And then there is a community, or there are several communities in Southeast, I believe, that are have special rates set up for but they're not dispatching them, but they have a special rate structure for hydro. But I see that Steve Colt is I don't know if he's shaking his head. He's not touching that.
I love that. No.
I don't know the exact number, but there are several communities doing it. And I think the interest is, as more communities, and now that the funding climate for renewables has changed, this isn't maybe as won't happen as soon as it would have otherwise, when there was more money available for more renewables. But as communities add additional renewables to their systems, at times when they have generation that exceeds the community load, one thing you could do with those is dispatch, meaning the utility can turn on and off loads such as like space heating or even something like electric vehicles, right? And so as more and more renewables come online, there would be more and more of an opportunity to sell these otherwise curtailed kilowatt hours. And so I think there is some interest in figuring out how that fits into the regulatory situation in Alaska.
Sure, and regulations are constantly being developed, whether it be electric vehicles, we start to see that. New technologies, we're starting to see that. And it's important to, again, the Administrative Order 360 is to look at old requirements, regulations, with the idea that there's going to be new ones, but overall we're looking at a certain reduction. There has to be new technology, there has to be new growth, and with that, new regulation. So yes.
All righty. Do we have any additional questions? We have about 3 minutes left. I don't want to dominate the conversation.
No, I appreciate the assistance. We all have our own little areas of expertise.
Well, do you have any closing remarks that you would like to?
No, I encourage people to go to our website, and if there's any regulations that they want clarification, change, this is the opportunity, just like we're having these types of discussions, to say, I'd rather have it this way. I would rather it not be there, or whatever the case may be. We need to have public input, and this is a chance, just like these, to share ideas. Maybe this would be better. Have you thought about this? So yeah, I mean, when I heard it, I was kind of like, this is such a broad topic, but I'll try to narrow down some things and get with other staff and and see what's most pertinent to talk about. But I appreciate the detailed questions. I'm like, whoa, okay. So certainly, if they send them to me, I can send them back out to you, or get some answers, or whatever the case may be. Just let me know.
We have a question that asks, what is your contact information?
My direct phone number is 907-263-2134. And my email address with Alaska, the state of Alaska, is Stephen, that's STEVEN .JONES at ALASKA.gov. So Stephen.Jones@alaska.gov.
Thank you so much. And I would just like to remind the audience that the RCA is here to serve the people of Alaska. So if anybody has questions about the Power Cost Equalization Program, or really anything that the RCA has purview over, feel free to contact them. That's what they're there for, and they'll be very happy to help you.
Yep.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to Stephen and your very informative presentation. Now I would like to invite Chris McConnell, Rural Programs Manager for the Alaska Energy Authority, to the virtual stage for his presentation, When the Storm Hits, Resilience and Response in Rural Energy Systems. Severe storms like Typhoon Halong test the limits of rural Alaska's energy infrastructure and emergency response systems. During this presentation, Chris will share updates from the Yukon-Kuskokwim region on storm impacts, recovery, progress, and the vital role of AEA's circuit riders in supporting communities through both routine and crisis situations. Circuit riders provides on-the-ground assistance with outreach, information gathering, and assessments of power generation, distribution, and bulk fuel infrastructure. Again, if you are interested in supporting relief efforts, please visit the Alaska Community Foundation Western Disaster Relief 2025 Fund, and the Association of Village Council Presidents Typhoon Halong support websites to see how you can help. We are dropping links to both of these resources in the chat for you now. Chris has worked in the rural Alaska energy sector for 9 years. He oversees a team of project managers working throughout rural Alaska microgrid communities to facilitate bulk fuel upgrades, rural power system upgrades, asset inventory and assessments, as well as distribution and maintenance and improvement projects. We also have a special guest. Mark Roberts is also with us today. Mark Roberts of the Alaska Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management will provide a broader perspective on the statewide disaster response and interagency efforts to strengthen community resilience. Right now, we will welcome Chris onto the stage. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. Good to be here. And Dominic, thanks for the introduction. I know this is kind of on the fly. Should Mark sort of being in having a broader view of the storm response and storm disaster, would it make sense, Mark, for you to give that overview first, or I'm happy to roll into things?
No, I think probably that might be a good way to approach it, Chris, is
Okay.
I can give you a quick overview and what we did, take any questions you have, and then I'll jet out and let you continue. Would that be all right?
Sounds good.
I'm Mark Roberts. I serve as the incident commander for the State Emergency Operations Center, and I execute the governor's authorities for disaster emergency response. And in this particular incident, I'm also serving as the state coordinating officer for the response. I'll just quickly give you a timeline, and then we can ask any questions or cover. On October 6th, we were notified by the National Weather Service of a very serious impending storm to the west coast of Alaska. Based upon that, we began community calls with the National Weather Service, advising communities of the potential of that storm, and kind of went to an enhanced watch in the State Emergency Operations Center. A couple days later, we got advised of a second storm, which is known as was Typhoon Halong. It actually held together quite a while and didn't become Typhoon Halong for quite a while. Even it was still an actual typhoon in Alaska waters. It was kind of unusual and held together. So seeing that, we went ahead and engaged. So the first storm struck. We engaged in the response. The governor declared a disaster. Most of the impacts were in the Northwest Arctic Borough. And we sent some National Guard, et cetera, to the Northwest Arctic Borough to help in Kotzebue, did some surveys in Kivalina, Deering, et cetera. That work is ongoing. We've completed most of those missions. Subsequent to that, the Typhoon Halong was coming. We pushed out people. The exact forecast and impact area was not certain. So we pushed people out to Nome, our disaster coordination staff. We call them branch directors or division supervisors. We pushed folks out to Nome, left the folks in Kotzebue, and then we pushed some additional folks out to Bethel. It turns out that this Typhoon Hailong impacts were most severe in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta area, catastrophic for some communities there. So we engaged in a search and rescue operations over the night, over the night of like the 10th or 11th, doing a number of rescues. We ended up rescuing over 51 people. Unfortunately, one person perished and 2 are still missing. Those communities that were severely impacted sheltered in their schools. For several of the communities, highlighted, of course, is Kipnik and Quig-Gilguk, but there were some others. The school became untenable. There was too many folks. Infrastructure was failing, so we made the extreme decision to evacuate them out of their community. We flew them by military aircraft, or rotor wing aircraft, mostly to Bethel. The shelter capacity in Bethel was exceeded, so we made the decision to fly them by military aircraft to Anchorage, where they were sheltered in 2 large areas. There's also sheltering, a small amount of sheltering going on in Bethel and in several other communities. And we're at the point now where we're doing several things simultaneously. First is if anyone still needs to be evacuated, they're being evacuated from the community, but we're down to 1 or 2 now. We're moving into impacted communities with the Alaska National Guard and other forces, the Division of Forestry and Fire Protection, the Department of Transportation and Public Facilities, the Department of Environmental Conservation, Yukon-Kuskokwim Health Corporation, Association of Village Council Presidents, all the infrastructure repairs and emergency home repairs. The goal is to stabilize these communities and fix as many homes as possible before the winter really sets in so that folks can reoccupy their homes. So that's one mission that's going on, being coordinated by what we're calling the Bethel branch. We have kind of a little command post set up in Bethel. Simultaneous with that, we evacuated the folks. We're running shelters, large shelters for us at the Alaska Airlines Center and at the Egan Center in Anchorage. We're supporting those folks as well as folks that are sheltered in other places or with friends and neighbors. The Red Cross has been heavily involved with us in doing that shelter support. We're beginning now to transition folks out of those large shelters and into what we call non-congregate sheltering. That's a temporary housing option, typically a hotel, until we can get them squared away for those that can't go back home to a longer-term housing solution through the winter. And then we'll work on a longer-term recovery to rebuild homes and help through volunteer groups and federal and state participation in the spring to rebuild homes and repair where homes were unable to be reoccupied or where they were just done interim repairs for folks to reoccupy those homes for the winter. So that's going on. All those things are simultaneous. Simultaneous with that also is the governor on October 9th declared a disaster for all the areas. And then on October 22nd, the president declared a disaster for some select areas that were hardest hit on the West Coast. So we're rolling out the government programs from the state and from the federal government, FEMA, to assist survivors, as well as there's a huge donations, volunteer effort going on. Literally hundreds of people who are giving up their time, their money, donating it to repair houses, to organize shipments of diapers and wipes and muck-out boots, all that going on simultaneously, including taking care of the pets that were evacuated. So all that is going on in coordination with the Association of Village Council Presidents, each tribal community, and Yukon-Kuskokwim Health Corporation, Tanana Chiefs Conference. It's kind of all hands on deck. So every day since probably about October 9th or so, and particularly into the next few days, there's been about 75 people in the State Emergency Operations Center having a briefing every morning and coordinating this response. We joined in with FEMA yesterday, and we did our first coordinated with the Federal Emergency Management Agency operational briefing today. And we begin to what we call decompress, move people out of the shelters where they were in a mass shelter and get them with their families in kind of an interim housing solution in a hotel. And I think we moved 9 families, over 100 people yesterday, and there's more of that happening today. That's kind of a big overall of the kind of major activities that are going on, and I'd be glad to answer any questions if you have them.
Okay, thank you so much for your update. Do we have any audience questions for Mark? Regarding FEMA, in the long term, will they have adequate funding?
So in terms of the FEMA programs, yes, it will be funded adequately through the federal government. In terms of making survivors who's had their homes and community destroyed, it'll never be enough. There is not, and it is, and so we're going to have to work together with a lot of volunteer folks to help these folks out. There's never enough money from the government. The programs are not designed to make you whole. They're to make you survive. And so there will not be, so if the question is a technical question, will the federal government fund the programs that are in law and have been activated by the president? The answer is yes. If the question is, will there be enough federal or state money for survivors to make themselves whole? The answer is no. We're going to have to work together as a whole community to solve that.
Are some of these communities already part of FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program?
I am not, some may be, I'm not exactly sure of the list. We have engaged the National Flood Insurance Program coordinator, and I don't know which communities are participating and which are not. It's a difficult challenge in rural Alaska because in order to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, there's some code requirements and inspection requirements that some of the local communities do not, and tribal villages do not have the overhead management capacity to fulfill those requirements.
Can you repeat what you said about the timeline for residents of Kipnuk and Quig potentially returning to their communities? What funding stream is available to reconstruct homes and infrastructure?
So the state of Alaska and the Federal Emergency Management Agency will provide survivors with the full benefit from the federal and state government. The federal programs provide what's called other needs assistance, individual assistance, and housing assistance. The state programs mirror that. When the federal programs are exhausted and there's still needs, sometimes the state can come in with their programs. We've already started the state program before the president declared. The state programs can come in on the back end. But I will tell you, there's not enough to take care of all the needs of survivors. Many of their homes have been destroyed. Some are moved, a mile or two downriver. So the purpose is to work together, and it's going to be a while. It's going to take a long-term commitment to work through volunteers and donations from all sorts of organizations in the spring for folks to get back. So the goal is for as many folks that can to get their homes fixed so they can reoccupy before winter, and folks that can't reoccupy to get them in a stable housing solution in a community of their choice. Right now they're in hotels in Anchorage, but in a longer term stable until they can go back to their home.
Okay. Has more than 25 million been approved by the federal government?
Yeah, it does. That 25 million, and I happened to be with the FEMA high leadership just the other day. That 25 million is not a cap. That is not a limit. I believe that was a dedication of the first down payment available for the state to draw down on. But FEMA is required by law to meet its statutory requirements for disaster assistance. And so if it exceeds 25 million, FEMA will meet that. So I wouldn't worry about the stated 25 million. I think that came out of a statement by the president very early without any paperwork behind it. And I think that was just an initial statement of what had been activated for this, but that's not the federal limit. The Federal Emergency Management Agency will meet they've made a commitment to us, will meet their statutory requirements to provide assistance, regardless of the dollar amount.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And we'll now transition back over to Chris.
Thank you. And thanks, Mark. I know you are awfully busy. I'm going to start out, if it's okay, sharing my screen. And I think just a reminder that I know everybody keeps in mind, but there are about 500 people in Kipnuk and Quig. And so obviously everything is quite personal within the communities. I spoke to some Quig leadership, including the tribal administrator, Gavin Phillip, yesterday, and got his blessing to talk a little bit about the one person that is deceased. And as Gavin reminded me, the community volunteers are still searching for the two missing. So Ella May was, it sounded like a classic auntie, known as Sweet and known for her cooking. And so again, a deep loss there. Her son Chester was artistic guitar player, known around for his singing. And then I was told by Gavin that Vernon Paul was basically the right-hand man of anything that had been built in Quig over the last several decades. So the folks still out there looking for Chester and Vernon, the folks that are on the ground in Quig. So just wanted to start with that and take a moment to appreciate those folks. As far as I'll sort of give a response from the AEA perspective, Alaska Energy Authority, where I am the manager of the rural programs here. And I think it's maybe important to think about the difference between an emergency and a disaster, and maybe it'll give some insights. In the month preceding the storm, there were emergencies in Adak. There's an ongoing outage in Akiak that predated the storm. Nunam Iqua had some issues. Moktarvik was out of power for more than a week. And so what typically happens in those situations is our circuit riders, Justin Twomey, Luke Jury, and Kyler Kilmer, they get that first call. And I'm going to share my screen again. This time, let's see if I can put this over here. And this kind of gives an insight into what our circuit riders might see on a day-to-day basis. They have the names, numbers, and first name basis with the folks that keep the lights on in these communities. So when there's an issue, we're logging it, communicating, and we're not built to sort of be a first responder. We're built more for technical assistance and coordination. We know who the contractors are. We talk operators through their issues, and it becomes a sort of switchboard of solving problems. Essentially, is what our circuit riders do in the powerhouse realm, the bulk fuel realm, and the distribution realm. And so, we deal with a lot of logistics. You can imagine when the power goes out in Adak for a week, getting a generator out to them on a barge, or, again, the Mark represented Homeland Security there, but SEOC, the State Emergency Operations Center, becomes involved when we declare an emergency, and that unleashes some logistics that enable us to help get the power back on. And so I bring up these emergencies because, as you know, whether you're on the rail belt, being out of power for a couple hours, for a couple days, starts to become more and more of a cascading issues. Obviously, when you're in the community, those outages start to have much more immediate impacts, ranging from, if you have backup generation, you're starting to use your fuel, burn through fuel at a rate that impacts your safety and sustainability through the winter. Boil notices might go out. There's water, lift stations, sewage. So all of these things become a much more immediate impact, even just with our emergencies. And so those hardships that are felt in those instances are real and not uncommon, really, whether it's a brownout or a blackout. And so our team is set up to be responsive to those folks on the ground. So now you move into a disaster where, in addition to the power being out, clearly your shelter, all of the sort of traumatic stories we heard kind of take a first order precedence over the fact that the light is out. It's the safety. And so our role there is, again, I think we're especially well placed to have relationships with those people's in the community when their power goes out. What can they do? Who do they call? And again, they'll look to us. We have some remote monitoring that we're able to sort of see what's happening, and we are charting who's got power, who doesn't, who we're in contact with. Another clear issue that goes on in the communities is the cell towers. If the cell towers lose power, then communication's out. And so that in this storm reaction, it became difficult to hear what's going on immediately because we had that sort of first string of, are your phones charged? Is the power, how long is the power going to stay on? And it's that secondary generation that started powering cell towers. And again, that's fuel being burned for those reasons. And you're in the awkward position of trying to reach out to people who are literally, water rising to their doorstep, and sometimes carrying clearly homes away. And so asking for information, asking for updates. I can tell you we had several calls here where I can't talk now, click, and you understand the immediacy of that. And yet we sort of keep grinding on to try to figure that out. And so I'll just sort of maybe go through that process of this storm, is who is doing what on the ground in the power sense. Clearly, safety, rescue, shelter, all of those things are becoming rightly put before the power. And yet the crews that we work with, power plant operators, utility managers, in some cases, guys who can do a bit of line work, it really is a testament to something we at AEA know, and I think a lot of people who work in rural Alaska know, that it's a handful of people that are doing quite a bit with quite a little to keep the lights on. And so in these emergency situations, it is community by community, a crew of men and women that are springing into action. And it's not just the power. If lines are going out and the boardwalk's ripped up and you're trying to do assessments, it kind of calls on all the skill sets and all the communication of folks there. And it also is worth mentioning, as the water receded and now the power folks are seeing what can be done, they've been clearing rubble for days. They've been helping evacuate folks, so that as the water receded and evacuation took place, there was oftentimes 10 to 12 people in the community and working tirelessly. So I'll Quig-Ilingok and Kipnuk rightfully got a lot of attention because they took the brunt of things. Clearly, a lot of other communities were hammered, but in Quig and Kip, there are just stories of these guys exhausted. So working for quite a time, not evacuate, and then get over, in the case of Kipnuk, over to Tuntatuliak to rest, or get on another charter out of Quig to Bethel to just rest for a time. And I can call out some names of leaders in Quig. Sam Addy is a general manager there, and he is an elder, and that's hard work and illness, colds, and still muscling through. So I'm just stating that so the folks on the ground trying to do this work were sort of in a state of exhaustion in the beginning stages. We hear a lot about the primacy of the schools, and so that becomes important because they have backup generation. In the case of Kipnuk, almost all the distribution being wiped out, and the school providing that backup generation, but it's the engine itself running at such low RPMs that it starts to fault. And that's the case we're seeing today. So that generator is being worked on by a mechanic right now to keep things going as they have line folks out there reacting. And so the next stage after those guys in the communities are working hard and communicating what they can is the Department of Transportation was able to release some emergency funds and got Bryce Inc., Chalista company and familiar with the region out there to really kind of bring in the troops. And I'd say in a parallel effort, the AVEC communities did a great job and have their own line crews under contract responding. And so from the AEA seat, we're looking at all the independent rural utilities, but also coordinating and just kind of keeping an ear to the ground in terms of what AVEC was up to. And so I think they should get some plaudits for reacting quickly and getting power up in most of their communities as quickly as possible. And so right now, Bryce, like I say, is out there doing assessments and fixing lines. This is where the logistics really crank into action here. And in some ways, I think a lot of people on this call are familiar with all of the challenges, hurdles that go with any kind of project in rural Alaska under the best of circumstances. Well, this becomes a microcosm of that, all of those challenges with the benefit of having sort of an enormous pool of resources. So Kipnuk and Quig need power poles. How do you get power poles into a community at this time of year? So, again, I think DOT and other organizations source some power poles in Nome. There gets a barge here put on these Herc military aircraft. Currently, there's helicopters flying around in both of those communities. There was a solar project scheduled for construction next summer in Quig. In a Connex, along with 2 generators in a separate Connex waiting to be installed on site. Those Connexes floated away, and I understand today they're spotting them with helicopters and then sending in a heavy lift helicopter to grab those, put them back into place. And so the sort of, like I say, the enormous resources are coming to bear on these communities to try to get them back up and running. And that meanwhile, while all that work is going on, there are also the leadership from these communities, in many cases, evacuated to Anchorage. And so from the AEA perspective, again, I think we are not first responders, not rich in resources to actively help, but I think where we're quite rich and have played an important role is in the information and relationships. And I go back to our circuit riders and the project managers that I work with, who on a first name basis with community leaders, with operators, with utility managers. And so that pool of relationships, phone numbers, outreach enabled us to get real time, what is happening on the ground, what do you need, who can we connect you with. And so in the case of Kipnuk, the entire crew got out back to Anchorage, and they knew what needed to be done in terms of stringing power back to the school, getting their tribal building up and functioning, potentially getting a work camp, and prioritizing clearing rubble and seeing what the future holds for the community. And meanwhile, the societal part of this is all their kids are now in school in Anchorage. So it sounds like the school's closed in Kipnuk for the rest of the year. What does that obviously has large implications, but also has power implications. And so the Kipnuk folks were here wanting to get back out with equipment and doing some line work. But with no service, obviously the utility is not going to be receiving any income here. And so AEA is able to facilitate effectively a power project loan that gets those guys paid, gets them back out in the community doing that work. And again, offering the sort of technical support, technical advice, and then Mark represented a lot of this in his comments there, but every morning there's a SEOC briefing where all of these organizations report out on what they knew, and AEA has been able to report out on power status in these communities every morning. And I think that information is then taken and helpful. We've fielded questions when other folks cannot get a hold of people on the ground there. Some of the contractor that it sounds like they're doing great work out there, making sure that they're coordinating with the utility folks. And they're quite sensitive to the fact that they're parachuting in and doing repairs. However, the guys that know these systems quite well are on site and more than capable of helping. I will say some kind of good things that have come of this is almost all the power issues were distribution. The powerhouses themselves in almost every single community, they withstood the storm. And I think that's a testament to some of the contractors and engineers that we work with that have built some of the newer modules over the last decades, that they're able to withstand hurricane force winds and flooding. And so that stability allows people to concentrate on the distribution and get things running again. And in the same regard, I think we dodged a bullet thus far with the bulk fuel facilities. And again, those operators and the folks that know the maintenance and improvement that we know needs to be done. And it's good to point out $1 billion worth of work that still needs to be done out there. And a lot of the work that AEA and the Denali Commission and the state and other federal funders have secured those bulk fuel facilities, improved the powerhouses so that it could have been worse, I guess, is the takeaway there. Again, I think that the storm response and now the moving future part of the storm response is where AEA has a strength. We have, files of all the projects we've had over the years. We have maps, we have imaging. When we hear that all of those residences got wiped out in KIPP, we have a distribution project lined up for construction next year in KIPP that was a complete rebuild. And one thing worth pointing out is the repairs that are going on right now to get power back up and running are temporary. They're not driving piles. They're not all of the things you need for a more permanent, sustainable power infrastructure. This is a fix. And so there's going to be a lot of work moving forward and figuring out what the load demands are in these communities after the leadership looks around and decides the path forward to rebuild. But I will say something I think the team at AEA knows well is that solid partners within the communities is what is keeping these communities going. And there's a great deal of tireless hard work going out there, and everywhere from the managers to the boards that are quickly executing paperwork. And, it highlights, again, the logistics of working in rural Alaska don't change whether you have to get something done in a day or you have several months to do it. So a lot of work gets done by cell phone, not email. And so getting through those hurdles, and I know there's been a lot of other organizations that have lent their expertise and technical assistance, even in terms of getting a quorum together for a tribal council and being the middle person between shuttling paperwork back and forth so that the bureaucracy keeps moving, but the projects that we see happening also need to keep moving. So that was a mouthful. I'm happy to take any questions or answer specific questions on communities if I can. I would say the sort of last thing maybe worth noting is we know that the communities that took the brunt of it and the challenges they face, but having traveled in the last week, there's other communities that you're not reading about where they lost a roof or quite a bit of, sporadic damage around. And the cleanup is massive, not just in the disaster communities we're hearing most about.
All right, let's move to some audience questions. How many circuit riders does the state, Alaska Energy Authority, have, and are there other entities that have similar programs? There used to be remote maintenance workers, but I'm unsure of who funded those.
The remote maintenance workers have played a huge role here too, and their funding is from the state, but also through a lot of the health corporations, federal funding. And so to back up a little bit, we have 3 circuit riders. Well, actually, a rural assistance manager who does some of that circuit rider work. Then we have a diesel mechanic, and we have a bulk fuel specialist. So that is 3 human beings doing the work that we could probably use triple that. I know that, like I mentioned, AVEC has a crew and does, I think I saw Bill stand on the line. He could probably speak to this better than I, obviously, but he's got a crew, and I think they have contractors. Going back to the RMWs, I mean, they like our circuit riders, I think, are Alaska famous. And any small airport in the world, they're going to know anybody that brushes their shoulder because they know the communities and the infrastructure as well as anybody. So as far as other orgs that are out there, I wouldn't call them naturally circuit riders, but clearly ANTHC, with all their water and sewer expertise, has crews that understand the needs of infrastructure and what makes things tick. But as far as a formal circuit rider on the power side, I think AEA is it. Not accepting the larger utilities and mid-sized utilities that have crews around the state.
Well, right now we don't have any more questions in the chat. I encourage people, if you have any questions, to bring those in. I do have a question. I wanted to ask roughly, so for a community whose powerhouse was completely destroyed, what is the process for getting funding to rebuild that, and what is the timeline for that?
Well, we have, like I said, not heard of any communities with a destroyed powerhouse. So the powerhouses have held up remarkably well. I think that it's an equally valid question on the distribution side. So, we have some projects that were planned, and it can be anywhere from sort of $6 to $8 million to rebuild a distribution network. And so I think I'm not putting a price tag on Kipnuk's rebuild, but it sounds in many ways like that's what they're going to be facing. Unclear where the funds will be available for that. In the case of Kipnuk, coincidentally, Alaska Energy Authority, in partnership with Kipnuk, was able to get a USDA high energy cost grant. And that's a $3 million grant with probably another $2 million from the state to get things up and running. And I should say, and also, I forget offhand, quite a bit of funding from the Denali Commission. So that's an array of good news. What that project looks like in a condensed timeline is a bit of a question mark. So Dominic, your question's a good one. And I think that we'll see what FEMA can do to make the infrastructure right. And then it's going to be looking to all the same old sources to see how we can adequately repair the distribution systems.
Is there any planning to create a fund for future disasters, for resources for power?
Sort of outside of the scope of AEA's mission, I think we have an emergency fund, like I kind of said on the beginning, but those emergencies, when your power's out, your power's out. It doesn't typically, it's not that important how it happened to you when you're sitting in the dark. And so we're built to sort of immediately respond with technical expertise, plug in a mechanic, lend a generator. But it's a modest budget that we do that on. So that would not be the fund or the imagined fund you're discussing. So I would leave that maybe to others on the call to see what that kind of planning looks like, other than the declaration of emergency.
Mhm. An audience member would like to know how long of power poles do villages need? The length of the power poles.
Great question. I do not know. I think they're a standard length up to the point where it depends on. I know you need pile driving in some of our boardwalk communities, so that's part of this issue. I think in Quig right now, SDG happened to have a loader there. So I know that they were working on that loader and seeing if they could get it to run, even though it got swamped with some of that water. And so it begins with being able to get heavy equipment in to plant the pole. And I would defer to others as to the actual length of those poles. But I do think the National Guard has been super helpful with their HERCs in terms of making sure poles are there, and also shout out to MEA, who stepped forward with quite a few transformers that I think are going to be crucial to getting the light back up in power and Quig and KIP.
Okay. Well, Bill Stam jumped in and said typically 40 to 45 feet. Thanks, Bill. Well, as of right now, we don't have any of the other questions, but we do have some comments. Emily said, I don't have a question, but I want to say thank you to Chris for all that he is doing for the communities that have been affected by Typhoon Halong. Chris is also a wonderful baseball coach. And then Bob said, thank you for all who are serving these folks. Okay, we still have 5 minutes. Does anybody have any additional questions for Chris regarding the storm and what has been going on in the aftermath of the storm?
I would just mention that because as information flows out there, Akiak, I mentioned, had a declared emergency. So Akiak is still out of power. However, that predated the storm, and they should be back online this Wednesday. We're hoping they had to get a whole new generator out there, and the storm and the disaster caused impacts, but what we see from AEA is the most resilient systems are the ones that are being maintained the best. So an undercurrent of that maintenance and operations is still the backbone of what's important to these communities. To you can't weather what happened to the distribution storm there, but your ability to get back up and running is certainly dependent on good maintenance, preventative maintenance, scheduled maintenance, and good management.
We have a question. What size generators?
What size generators per community? Typically, you want 3 or 4 so that you have 1 or potentially 2 to carry the load, and then you can take one of those offline and bring a third generator up while you're doing preventive maintenance, changing oil. So those can be anywhere from 150 to 250 kW, really depending on the size and the needs of the community. But it's important that you have sort of at least 3 well-maintained generators, almost no matter what size community, so that if something fails, you can bring one on, and during your routine maintenance, you can cycle generators in and out.
One participant notes that he heard there are daily meetings and asked if some of these meetings seek answers to transportation issues.
Transportation issues, meaning transportation to and from hubs and Anchorage, or transportation on the ground in communities?
Both.
Yeah, I think they're, again, outside the mission of AEA, but having sitting in those emergency operations center meetings, there is certainly talk about, and I think great cooperation on available seats on charters and people who want to get back, who, when the lights come on and if their homes are okay, want to get back to their home. I think there's talk about getting the essential workers back first. And then as far as transportation in the community, I think that some of the side-by-sides and the four-wheelers obviously were lost. I have heard that some on the Canva, the transport planes, some communities are getting transportation back for the folks that I mentioned, like the utility workers, to get around where they can. But in some cases, the boardwalks are so torn up, that getting around is entirely dependent on what the terrain looks like. The other part to that is the fuel dispensing. From what we've heard, that's still pretty good. Most of the spills were from home heating attached to the home. So just a lot of cleanup. So I'm not sure what the priority is there, except for quite a bit of work is being done to clear the runways, and already dealing with frost heaving and keeping lights on near the runways is a priority. But
Okay, well, thank you so much. There were a couple of questions that came in at the last minute, and we are now out of time. It's time to transition to our final panel for the day. But I would like to thank both Chris and Mark for being with us today. Thank you so much for your presentation. And also, I would just like to remind people about the two links up in the chat to donate to for the storm relief efforts. Now I'd like to close out our first day of the Business of Alaska Rural Energy Workshop. I'd like to invite the moderator of our next presentation, Microgrids, Macro Challenges, the Realities of Running Rural Alaska's Power Systems, to the virtual stage. Andrew Jensen has worked for Governor Dunleavy since October of 2021. First as a communications assistant and currently in a policy advisor role for food and energy security. Prior to that, he was the managing editor of the Alaska Journal of Commerce from 2012 to 2021 after moving to Alaska to work for the paper as a reporter in 2010. He has a bachelor's degree in journalism with a minor in political science from the University of Arkansas. As the moderator of our next presentation, Andrew will be introducing our speakers. Welcome, Andrew.
Well, thank you, Dominique. And again, thank you to all the presenters that we've had so far from the various agencies, both state and federal. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion because now I think we have a chance to really put it together with Jason Custer of Alaska Power and Telephone and Bill Stam of the Alaskan Village Electric Cooperative. Combined, these two gentlemen represent 99 utilities, which, as we talked about, are around a couple hundred small communities, microgrids. It's about half of our utilities in these rural areas. So I think this is really going to tie in our discussion well. And so with that, we're going to start off with Jason Custer. Jason Custer is the Vice President of Corporate Development for the Alaska Power and Telephone, where he has worked since 2013. AT&T is an employee and investor-owned utility established in 1957, providing services in 40 rural communities in Alaska. Jason has been involved in leading numerous hydropower, transmission, microwave, and fiber optic projects, from finance to project management to operations. He served on boards of Alaska organizations, including the Southeast Conference, the Alaska Chamber, the Ketchikan Chamber of Commerce, REAP, Tongass Federal Credit Union, Haida Energy, and the Juneau International Airport. So with that, I will throw it to Jason for his presentation. Thank you, Jason.
Thanks, Andrew. It's great to be here. I'm going to pull up my slide deck here. Okay, so I'm here to talk about the business of electrical service in rural Alaska, using Alaska Power and Telephone as kind of a case study. As Andrew explained, AT&T was established in 1957 before statehood in Skagway. We're headquartered in Ketchikan. We serve 40 rural communities. You can see them on the map here, everywhere from Prince of Wales, Haines, Skagway, Gustavus, up to some interior communities and the area around Tok. We have our own in-house engineering resources. We have line crews, customer service folks, of course, and then we use contractors quite a bit as well. We're 75% hydro-based, 90+% in Southeast Alaska, sometimes with more hydro than we can use. And our oldest hydro is Dewey Lakes from 1902. And we'll take a look at the next slide. So APT is fairly unique in that we're an investor-owned utility. So our largest shareholder is an employee stock ownership program that owns about 40% of the shares. Most of the remaining shares are owned by either former employees or their families and descendants. There's some public float that trades on the pink sheets under the ticker APTL. We pay around a 3% dividend generally over time, and then we reinvest some of our earnings into new infrastructure, which we have to do to keep things current and working. Our primary lender and source of debt is CoBank, which is a Farm Credit System member, and our power operations are economically regulated by the RCA. And we'll go to the next slide and look at what that means. So the RCA, rather than APT, sets utility rates for us through a public process with an opportunity for public involvement. It's a 15-month statutory process that sometimes can be a bit faster. We have what are called cost of service-based rates. So our rates are based on what it's actually costing to provide service. Well, how do you know that? Well, during our rate case, we kind of open up our books and our accounting, and we use what's called a test year, which is a historic year of operations, and always a look-back approach. You're looking back at the prior year's costs and operations. Then we'll go to the next slide where the juicy stuff is. So everyone wants to know, how does a private utility make money? And here is the magic formula for classic cost-based regulation. The utility's revenue requirement, which is the total amount of money it must collect from its rates, that is equal to its operating expenses plus your rate base, which is what the utility has invested in the utility system, its capital investment, rate base minus depreciation, times the rate of return. And your rate of return is a weighted average cost of capital that reflects your actual cost of debt that's passed through to customers at cost. And then there's also a cost of equity as well, which ends up being around 12% at best, but usually a bit lower. For us, it's a bit lower. So what this formula means is that the utility only earns a return on the equity investment it's made in capital projects. It doesn't get any kind of return or a markup on its operating expenses. The regulators look at what capital investments the utility has made, and that's what the utility gets its regulated rate of return on. And then the utility is not allowed to include grant-funded assets in the rate base because something else has paid for the assets. You don't get to charge the customers for them. Let's go to the next slide. The reality of doing business as a regulated utility in Alaska. This is a really tough business. The money that you make, your profit, the return on equity, is junior to all of the other requirements of the utility. And so your achieved return on equity that investors actually receive almost always lags behind the RCA approved authorized return on equity. And that's because the 15-month rate making process and the use of a historic test year means the utilities rates are always based on what things used to cost a year or almost 2 years ago. And meanwhile, the utility's cost of doing business goes up constantly, and the utility has to make new investments that are not in the rate base that it's using in its rate case. And this phenomenon of always being behind is called regulatory lag. Now, the utility has to take a significant portion of its earnings and reinvest them in the utility system to make sure that everything keeps working. As I mentioned, there's no profit on operating expense. That's like a pass-through cost to the customers. And the business only grows, and the revenue that it produces for its investors only grows when the utility makes new capital investments. So this is a tough investment environment. You know, the classical term for utilities are a widows and orphans style investment because it produces a bond-like return, slow and steady over time, except that as an Alaska utility in these rural communities, APT has added risk because we're in a very difficult investment environment and operational environment. And the next slide talks about that. Challenges we face on the next slide include regulatory lag, as I mentioned. The rural communities are generally not growing. Economies are not diverse. Sometimes they're heavily reliant on one industry like tourism or forest products business. Diseconomies of scale, very small communities, they're extremely remote. There's significant socioeconomic distress. There's not a lot of money in the rural communities. Logistics are very challenging and expensive. Oftentimes we're flying things in, we're barging things in, taking them in on the ferry because of infrastructure limitations and the roadless rule in Southeast Alaska. And it's very hard to attract and retain a qualified workforce. You know, it really takes a certain type of person to want to live in rural Alaska. And, you know, even if like one person, the person you're hiring likes hunting and fishing and being outdoors, the family, that person's family has to enjoy living in rural Alaska too. And there are limited amenities and services, and it's a tough place to live. And so hard to find workers and keep them around. And then, of course, nobody likes paying the utility for an essential service. And nobody likes when the utility has to increase its rates to stay up to keep pace with costs. And so this can make it difficult to collaborate with the community on grants and special projects. Like if you're having a rate case and people are unhappy about that, it makes partnership challenging at times. Now, the next slide talks about some interesting aspects that I'll call freakonomics of investor-owned utilities in Alaska. So this is stuff you may not be aware of that's interesting and fun to consider. So the regulators must allow utilities an opportunity to earn a reasonable return on equity, or the rates are what they call confiscatory and unconstitutional. Like if the government doesn't let you charge enough money to recover your costs and have a reasonable return on equity, there is court precedent, legal precedent, that that's an illegal form of confiscation by the government. So the regulators have to give you a rate that makes you whole as a utility. A lot of people don't realize the cost of the utility's rate case, their legal expense, ordinarily ends up being recovered from consumers in customer charges. Those expenses typically are capitalized, and so the utility, whatever it costs to do the rate case, they get it back with a return on investment. There's also a tremendous risk-reward asymmetry for investor-owned utilities. The utility gets the same return on investment for doing a new, clean, exciting, fun, renewable energy project. They get the same return on equity that they would have gotten if they simply bought more trucks or bought more things to add to their inventory, or if they capitalize their legal fees. You don't get extra return for taking on more risk. And developing new energy projects in rural Alaska is very risky. So that's really a significant challenge. Something else people don't understand is if the utility develops a new renewable energy source that's more economic, you don't get to arbitrage diesel costs. And what I mean by that is if everybody's paying 40 cents a kilowatt hour for diesel, and the utility comes in and creates a hydro project or a solar project that provides 10-cent power, the utility doesn't get to charge 15-cent power and get extra return. They just get the regulated return on their capital investment through the formula, the magic formula from a couple slides ago. And you're getting about, you know, a 12% authorized return on equity. So very challenging and not as exciting as people sometimes think it might be in terms of an investment. And then we'll go to the last slide here, which has more fun freakonomics. So here's something, this is very significant. Because PCE helps out with residential energy costs, and it's kind of like the first on the scene to help with the rising cost of energy. If the utility does something to reduce the cost of energy, well, PCE is the first and primary beneficiary. So if your cost of power is 80 cents a kilowatt hour, if PCE is buying it down to 25 cents, and the utility comes in and does something that cuts the cost of power in half with a new hydro project, well, the residents are still going to be paying about 25 cents. PCE is what ends up harvesting a lot of the cost savings. And then, your residents and your ratepayers wonder, well, hey, you did this new hydro project, you put in this new solar project. Why am I still paying what I have been paying on my bill every month? Well, this is why, because PCE slurps up a lot of that benefit and drinks your milkshake. Also, you can't depreciate grant-funded assets, but the utility has to repair and eventually replace those assets at its own cost. So if you get like a totally free, completely paid for by the government intertie in 30, 40 years, or however long it lasts, you're going to have to replace that thing with your own money. Another challenge for AP&T as a private utility, we actually have to pay taxes on grants. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act made grants treatable as ordinary income for taxes. So there's been projects where we can't apply for a grant because there's not enough revenue in the community to pay the taxes we'd have to pay on it. As I mentioned, you can include grant-funded assets in your rate base. You can't earn a profit on grants. So if an investor-owned utility uses a grant to build something rather than its own money, it's, in a sense, taking an investment opportunity away from itself and taking bread off its own table. So there's a natural economic disincentive then for the utility to use grants. Now, AP&T does use grants. We try to incorporate them wherever we can into our investment strategy. Another interesting thing is that schools can't use community facility PCE. There's PCE for community facilities. But in a very small community, a lot of times the school is the main community facility, serving as a multi-purpose facility. So we have some communities, the school is the main community facility, but they're only able to use about 10% of their community facility PCE because the schools don't qualify. And then finally, if you build a new renewable energy project, say a new solar project, you may still have to recover the cost of your old obsolete asset. If you have a bunch of investment that you made in your old utility system, the investor-owned utility can't and doesn't just write that off. It still has to recover that over time. So you can't just reduce the cost of energy simply by building new energy projects all of the time. You have to think about the embedded costs that the utility still has to recover. And that's the end of my presentation. There's a thank you slide. I will pass the mic back to Andrew, and I will let you all pepper me with questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jason. I thought you raised a lot of real interesting points around the challenges, and that I think what we even referenced at the very top of this presentation is a program today. There's not a silver bullet to solve this. It's very, very complex from the utility perspective to manage this. So, and someone who definitely understands this issue as well, we're gonna kick it to him right now. I'm very happy to bring up Bill Stamm to join this virtual stage with us. Bill is the president and CEO of the Alaska Village Electric Cooperative, and he joined AVEC 2 months after moving to Alaska in 1993. He's held a variety of positions in operations and engineering and has been AVEC's CEO for the past 4 years. Bill uses his experience in design, construction, contracts, finance, and logistics to guide improvements in the utility, serving 58 remote communities with 46 power plants, 32 wind turbines, and 500 miles of power distribution. And I know that Bill has definitely had his hands full in several of his communities for the last several weeks. And so we really do appreciate his time and helping to come on and share some more of his expertise and experience with us today. So with that, I would like to throw it to Bill Stamm.
Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate the introduction, and thank you to Jason. He did a lot of the heavy lift talking about the technical aspects of finance and rate making. That applies to all utilities. It's similar. We have a little bit different business model than an investor-owned. We are an electric cooperative, so we are owned by the members that we serve. But many of the things that Jason talked about, not being able to include grant-funded projects in depreciation, or the effects of renewable energy projects on power cost equalization, the rate lag when you're trying to figure out what's appropriate to charge for electricity. You're always looking in the rearview mirror and trying to estimate what things are going to be in the upcoming year. That's been a huge impact. We've seen almost a hockey stick change in prices for commodities and equipment, and a lag in availability of materials. Chris McConnell in the previous presentation mentioned that Matanuska Electric Association just made available, I don't think they donated, but they made available close to 40 transformers to help with rebuild of Western Alaska. That's huge, because it's taking 50 to 60 weeks on average to get transformers. So if you ordered transformers today, you wouldn't get them for a year. And then there's logistical challenges of getting them out to rural Alaska. So really appreciate everybody's work together in bailing things out in Western Alaska. But for my part, I'll talk a little bit more about AVEC, Alaska Village Electric Cooperative, kind of how we differ from an investor-owned being a cooperative. And a lot of the information that's been shared this morning kind of already did the heavy lift, as far as a lot of times I'm not sure who the audience is, but if it's a national audience, there's a lot of work that has to go into explaining what Alaska's like, how big Alaska is, what it's like to be off the road system. But the communities AVEC serves, only one of them is on the road system. That's Minto. It's about 3 hours north of Fairbanks. Everything else is barged or flown in. Andrew listed a couple of the stats by the numbers for AVEC. And, it's a long list of things, but pull out a couple of things on this slide. If you're good with math, at the bottom there, you see our 2024 cost of service for all of the communities was about $74 million. And we only sold 125 megawatt hours. So if you do the math, that's averages out to about 60 cents per kilowatt hour cost for energy. Now because there's so many communities, such a variety of sizes, that rate is probably anywhere between 30 cents a kilowatt hour up to $1.20 a kilowatt hour, depending on what your fuel supply looks like. And one of the things that's different about AVEC maybe than communities in the Southeast or other places, we have no hydro resources. We are working with the tribe in Old Harbor to try to develop one, but that is the only place so far that we found that it pencils out to develop a hydro resource. We are 95% diesel generation. We've been integrating wind and more recently solar to help displace fuel costs. And I think as I go through my presentation, I'm going to mention fuel and fuel cost quite a bit. It is really what is the focus, or has been the focus, for AVEC, trying to reduce the cost of power in Western Alaska, and all the different things that we do. It all comes back to cost of fuel. So we've got 8,500 members, 11,500 meter locations. So obviously some of the members own more than one building that gets electricity from AVEC. Overall, it's about 31,000 population in all those 58 communities. That's about the population of Juneau or Fairbanks, but probably use about 1/3 of the energy if you were to compare, energy that's used in any of those larger communities that are consolidated. There's not a whole lot. There's, I'd say, zero industrial load. We do have a bit of what we call commercial load, larger loads. Those are going to be your schools, your airports, your water plants, some of the stores, things like that. But we used to have, I think, up to 5 fish processing facilities throughout the different communities, but all of them except for one is left. The one remaining is down in Yakutat. Everything else in Western Alaska, as far as our communities are concerned, that used to have fish processing, has either moved offshore or closed down completely. I guess I want to back up, talking a little bit about the governance of AVEC. We're owned by the members we serve, so everybody that has a meter has a vote in AVEC. The communities each hold their own annual meeting. They elect a delegate to come to Anchorage for our larger annual meeting. Each of the members elect a 7-member board, and that board is, each of the board members serve at large. You have to be a member of AVEC in order to serve on the board. And we meet 5 times a year to discuss projects and finance and things that are going on in AVEC. And then there's that one annual meeting where all the delegates from the different communities come together with the board and the staff, and we work on planning and the guidance of the cooperative. So although we are, I like to say, on the cutting edge of technology, we have been integrating wind and solar and small microgrids. It's all a buzz with national labs and different locations. We still do a lot of things the old-fashioned way, or the way we've been doing them for 50 years. If you look up on this screen, you can see our linemen, except for possibly in Yakutat and Bethel, our linemen climb every pole that they have to work on. We have tank farms in order to store the fuel that we need in order to generate power. Katie mentioned early this morning, BIA tanks that have been around for 50 years. That's some of them right there. You see the picture. They've been repainted in some of our communities. We cut the bottoms off and replaced rusty bottoms and put them back in service. There's lots of tank farms that have been upgraded with newer horizontal tanks and those sorts of things. But we do try to maintain facilities as well as we can and keep them going for as long as possible. Primarily diesel generation. The unit you see there is about a 500 kW unit. Our units range from 150 kW to 1.2 megawatts for most of the communities. Bethel is an outlier. It's a hub community in Western Alaska. It's got a population of about 6,000. It's got a 4 megawatt base load and 8 megawatt peak. So we have 6 2.2 megawatt units that we operate and maintain out there. But that is, it's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Most of the other communities have populations anywhere from 100 to 1,000 people, and loads that are much lower than that. The means and methods of doing things in rural communities. In the bottom right corner of that screen, you see an AVEC line truck. Essentially, it's often carrying a trailer, or a sled is used to carry the gear and the hot stick and the climbing gear, battery drill, and that sort of stuff for alignment. All of the stuff that we send to our communities has to either be flown or barged in. It's quite a bit of logistical challenges. And on the receiving end, there's not always a lot of heavy equipment or roads necessarily. In order to move things around and get things into position, we often have to schedule work in winter months so that we have frozen conditions and to move heavy equipment. It all wouldn't be possible without the dedication of staff and employees. We've got about 90 full-time employees based out of our Anchorage office. Well, I guess there's 90 full-time employees, 10 or 12 in Bethel, 2 in Yakutat. The rest are out of our Anchorage office, and 40 or so traveling technicians. Those are going to be linemen, mechanics, constructors, welders, control specialists, all sorts of folks that go out and maintain the systems, plant operator trainers. We also have about 120 part-time power plant operators. So each community, much like were explained in the smaller communities that may not be associated with a larger group or cooperative like AVEC, individual part-time power plant operators' primary duties are to make sure that the power plant is running. They change the oil, change the filters, make sure that there's no leaks or drips. And if something drastically goes wrong, they're usually on the phone looking for additional assistance, whether that be engineering or maintenance or operations. And AVEC supports not only infrastructure, but also the supply line and technical backup for those sorts of things. So where does AVEC's money go? I said we had a cost of about $74 million across all those communities. And in this pie chart, you can see that far and above everything else is the cost of fuel. It's always more than half the cost of operations for AVEC. The next big piece of the pie is actually operating and running our power plants. That includes the cost for overhauling engines, replacing variable speed drives, anything that has to do with a power plant operation, maintenance, building maintenance, re-insulation, roofing, new decks, stairways, safety improvements, those sorts of things. And the list goes on. The things that control AVEC, I guess one of the things I forgot to mention early on is that AVEC is not economically regulated by the RCA. So the membership of AVEC voted itself as a non-regulated utility because they own the utility themselves. The members could vote to do that. But obviously there are batter boards on what we can charge for power. The consumer's main interest is to keep energy costs low, so they don't want the rates to go up any more than they have to. And we have some covenants that we have to follow. Being a 501c3 corporation with the IRS, there's certain things that you have to do as far as maintaining any margins or profits that you gain from selling electricity. Those go into a pool of patronage capital, and we can use that patronage capital for improving infrastructure by investing in capital projects. But eventually, over the years, we return that margin to the members that we serve. So when we retire capital credits, we look back at what power people have purchased from us. It's usually looking back 10, 15, 20 years, and we divvy out whatever margins we had from those years and pay back those consumers based on how much power they bought. So it's kind of a long-term banking thing where they give us money now, we spend it over time and then return whatever margin or profit we have over time. Because fuel cost is so high, we've been pretty aggressive in integrating renewables where we can. Most or all of these projects are highly grant funded, not 100%. There's been quite a bit of skin in the game for AVEC, adding 10, 15, 25% to the cost of these projects. So that's money that we collect from our members, and then we leverage to get additional funding and do these larger projects. It's a long list of things that we've done over the years. You can see that the last wind turbine we installed was in 2023, but we haven't not been doing renewables over the last couple of years. We've primarily been concentrating on repowering a couple of our sites. We've been working with independent power producers for installing solar battery systems. We've applied for grants and received some funding to do a solar battery project ourselves. So we're adding energy storage and then upgrading our power plants to make them able to receive or integrate with renewables. So that's an upgrade to the control and switchgear in each of the power plants. It's a lot of internal work, and it's a little bit of a juggle because you've got to keep the power plant running while you're ripping out all of its guts and replacing it with newer stuff. Just a list of items. You can read through it if you like, of other projects that we've got ongoing this year. I want to talk a little bit about, and I see we're getting close on time. I'm going to finish up quick. I want to talk a little bit about comparative price of energy, rural Alaska compared to maybe the rail belt. So these are barge delivery costs for AVEC. Again, it varies widely depending on how far away you are from the source and how you get the fuel to location. Up in Noatak, Shungnak, Ambler, those sorts of places, we have to fly fuel in, and it can be as much as $12 a gallon. The majority of our places are between $3 and $5 a gallon. And if you convert that to the cost per million BTU British thermal unit, you know, it's an energy equivalent. So you could burn a pile of leaves in your backyard and figure out how many BTUs that puts out. But if you want to compare that to perhaps what it costs for natural gas on the rail belt, right now the electric utility in Anchorage is paying, I think, $7.50 from MCF, which is 1,000 cubic feet, and that is the equivalent of about 1 million BTUs. So I know there's a whole bunch of angst over limited supply and Cook Inlet and those sorts of things. Some of the things that are considered would double the cost of energy on the rail belt for electric utilities and also heating throughout Anchorage. And that's near and dear to my heart because I'm an Anchorage resident. But even if it doubled the cost, it would be still quite a bit less than what we're paying day to day and have been paying in rural Alaska for energy. And this is what AVEC pays. There's certainly an additional cost once fuel is landed in the community. If you're talking about retail sales and stuff, they're going to be much higher than that for the residents in rural communities that have to buy fuel for transportation or heating. Impact of power cost equalization. Different folks have talked about it. I think Steve mentioned earlier that it's not a big chunk of the energy picture, even on the electricity side, and then you have to consider home heating and those sorts of things. But for AVEC, this is kind of the layout. The pie chart on the left kind of shows where the power is coming from, or where the energy purchases are coming from. 36% commercial. There's a big chunk of school. Schools are usually the biggest building in town. And everything on the left-hand side of that pie chart is eligible for power cost equalization. Everything on the right is not. So commercial services, schools, mom and pop shops, four-wheeler shops, all the stores, they're paying full boat, and it's reflected in everything they do. Obviously, if you're buying a loaf of bread at the store and the store has to pay full price for energy, they've got a higher cost than most. But not everything on the left is reimbursable by PCE. There's thresholds and those sorts of things. So in the end, the benefit of power cost equalization pays for about 20% of the revenue that AVEC makes on an annual basis. I'm not saying it's not great. It's a huge benefit, huge boost. But to think that it's a panacea, that it's paying for all the energy in rural Alaska, would be false. And then there's the whole home heating expenses. This is an older graphic, but I think it still holds true in rural communities. Majority of people heat with diesel in Anchorage. Majority of people heat with natural gas. But if you think about the cost differential between natural gas and diesel fuel, you can see that just the cost of energy in rural Alaska is huge. I'm not going to read these to you. Basically, things that AVEC has done, and these slide decks will be available so you could read through them at your leisure later. But we try to consolidate and make sure that our systems are very energy efficient, and we do whatever we can to reduce the cost of diesel. And here's a list of things that we've been doing in the past, and I just want to wrap up so we've got time for questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Bill and Jason, for that. Very, very informative. And as I've been watching our attendees, they've maintained pretty steady here. So hopefully they will stick with us for a few more minutes to hit some of these questions, because I do know that there's some issues here that are important, and I think are going to help set the table for tomorrow, where we're looking at, what are people doing to address these challenges. And so one I'm going to go with, which I think is something a lot of people are interested in, which is these community solutions, IPP solutions, where, if the grant funding, is an issue, if community can get it, work with the utility, there's been a lot of interest in this. So just to start with you, Bill, because I think you mentioned that this is some of the work you've been doing. There's been more interest in recent years by independent power producers installing these community-sized renewable energy products to sell to the utility. And then what is the business consideration for you for either entering or not entering a power purchase agreement with an IPP? And kind of along with that, kind of how can the communities, if they want to plan for these kind of projects, are there resources available for them?
Yeah, I guess for AVEC in general, it really depends on who the IPP is. We're not necessarily interested in Sunshine, California coming in and saying, we want to put in a project in your community and we can undercut the cost of electricity. What we have been doing is partnering with tribal organizations and communities that have a resource to be able to either get grant funding or their own funding to put in a renewable project that will grab the resources that they have available, typically that's solar, add that to the system and integrate it with our electrical system. We work out an agreement where they're paying, or we're paying them less than our displaced cost for diesel fuel. So rather than buying diesel at X, we're buying electricity already made at a price of less than X for the diesel. And it's a benefit for all of the consumers in that community. And the money that we would typically spend for diesel fuel is going back into that community and hopefully supporting jobs and economic growth.
Thanks, Bill. And then for you, Jason, as an investor-owned, an employee-owned utility company, are there different considerations for you, or kind of when you're thinking about working with a community or an IPP type of project, what are the considerations for you and how do you approach those opportunities?
We're technology agnostic, and we are agnostic as to who we partner with. We want to give people affordable energy in a responsible way, and we're willing to work with anyone to do that. However, if you're interested in doing that, you really need to start talking to the utility as early as possible in the process. One of the issues we've seen is folks will start doing energy planning or planning some kind of project. They get real far down the line, and then they approach the utility and they find out that, you know, the premises or the business model that they had in mind doesn't fit with what is allowable or workable. So I would say if you're interested in that, start talking to your utility as early, like on day one, before you do anything else. But we're partnering currently with ANTHC on some projects. We co-own a hydropower project that's an IPP with Haida Corporation that sells energy to us. It's 50% AT&T, 50% Haida Corporation selling energy to us. We work with different tribes that can access grants to set up unique arrangements to help fund utility improvements. And we even have our own IPPs that sell energy to ourselves. We have hydro IPPs that we set them up as separate companies. And when they're set up that way, there's a bit more of a PCE benefit to the community. So we're willing to look at or do anything, but it has to be, you know, commercially available, reasonable technology. We don't want to do experiments with pre-commercial technology that is not reliable or safe. And, you know, if like a pre-commercial technology doesn't work out and the utility has invested in it, it still has to recover the cost of the failed project. So, but I would say, you know, every project is very different, but by going to the utility first and talking to them about it, you know, we can help figure out what could be workable.
Great, thanks. And, you know, and we have another question here, you know, thinking about your, like, I guess, future needs, looking at equipment, transportation, you know, and these costs in the future. And I wonder if maybe you could, you know, Jason and Bill both, you know, kind of go through how you're able to set rates and what the regulators will do. And so I just kind of basically say, like, hey, I'm looking down the road and I think it's going to cost this for transportation or for equipment. Can you put that in your rate or not?
Well, ours is, and traditionally, cost-based rate making is based on a historical test year where you're like looking in the rear view mirror rather than looking forward. Now, you can propose what are called pro forma adjustments. If you know that there's some big unique cost coming up, you can tell the regulators, hey, we ought to have this in our rate base because we know this thing is coming along. Or if you had something, you know, in the rear view mirror that was like a odd one-time thing, you may need to make a pro forma adjustment to take that out. So you can try to do that. Regulators are very conservative. Generally, they like to use the historic test year approach. But utilities that are not regulated by the RCA do what is called prospective rate making, where they look ahead, like the water utility and the sewer utility in Skagway. They gave themselves rate increases going into the future, knowing the cost of things will go up, so they can kind of keep up with that. But as an investor-owned utility regulated by the RCA, we're really using like an old-fashioned type approach.
And then, Bill, for you as well, you know, preparing for future costs, whether it's O&M for a grant-funded project or et cetera, how are you able to set rates or to plan for those future expenses?
Yeah, So we have a public hearing process, and we can't just set our rates at anything. It doesn't have to go through the RCA for regulatory review. However, we are quasi-regulated because the RCA does look at our rates when they're reimbursing us for power cost equalization. So they do look at what our rate base is, and they do say, well, this is how much you actually need to make in order to stay alive and earn a certain amount of percentage on profit. And they won't pay anything above that. So it is a little bit, I guess, quasi-regulated, but we don't have to go through the rigorous RCA process. We appeal to our members and explain to them what our rate case is and what the cost is expected to be. And it's, I guess it's our main obligation is to keep our lenders happy. We've got over $80 million in debt, and our bankers like to see that we're going to be able to pay that debt back. So if we're getting behind in our bills, it's not good for anybody.
Thanks, Bill and Jason, on that one. And then Bill, just I think this is probably a straightforward one for you. If the energy costs decline or go up in one AVEC community, do they drop or go up in all AVEC communities?
So AVEC has what it calls a postage stamp rate. Aside from Bethel, all of our other communities have the same energy cost. The big variable, and that's about 30 cents kilowatt hour for most of the smaller communities. The big variable is the adder for fuel cost. And as I mentioned, that can vary substantially, changing the costs up to more than $1 per kilowatt hour. But if, AVEC kind of smooths out the rate for all of the communities as far as an energy charge, we don't do an energy charge specific to every community.
Jason, and this, I think when we had our preliminary conversation for this panel, and I asked both of you this question, I think that Matthew might be getting at something here in the King for a Day. And maybe we can kind of leave with this because I think it touches on where some other questions are in terms of where I think you touched on, where there can be a disincentive to do certain things that the community may want, that you may want to do as a utility, but sometimes things are upside down. So the question that Matthew has here, is there a reform at either RCA or elsewhere when you talk about where you could capture some more benefit from a lower cost of power that could give you the proper incentive to do these projects? So give you that King for a Day question, and in that example, I'll let you take it from there, and then Bill will take you on the King for a Day turn.
Well, only a fool would want to be king for a day, and only a king would want to be a fool for a day. So I'll dodge that part. But what I will say is there's something called PBR, not the PBR you might remember drinking in college, but performance-based regulation, which they have it in Hawaii, and they use it pretty aggressively there. And what they do is the regulators say, okay, these are the things we'd like the utility to do. We would like, certain social outcomes. We'd like more distributed generation. We'd like you being more aggressive about renewables. We'd like you doing this and that, having special consumer programs, all this stuff. And we'll give you targets and KPIs. And if you can meet them, then you get to make extra money. And if you can't meet them, there's a stick. So they use, through performance-based regulation, they give you these carrots and sticks that give the utility economic incentives to pursue social objectives. But we have nothing like that in Alaska at all. We are following like the 1890s Mr. Burns from The Simpsons type model of performance-based regulation. It really hasn't changed much over the years. But if people want, different societal outcomes, like this sort of stuff, well, then, yeah, you need to come up with carrots you can dangle in front of the utility. Or take away some of the sticks that may be stopping them from doing things that you would like.
I will withdraw my presence, but Bill, what would be on your table if you could change something, regulatory, statutory, if you see incentives or policies that are misaligned with what you and your members would like to see the utility do, and especially keeping about the ultimate goal of bringing down costs?
Yeah, well, again, our intersection with the Regulatory Commission of Alaska really is focused on power cost equalization. So probably my comments would only be, would only pertain to that. And a couple of speakers have mentioned that there are some oddities in the way PCE reacts when you integrate large amounts of renewable energy in a community. It seems to be a bit of a disincentive, but I think the regulation as it's written is technology agnostic. It's just that the impact can be negative for a community after they've donated land, committed a lot of resources, and built these projects, and they don't feel like they've seen the benefit that they were expecting. So
yeah, that's, I guess, what touches on actually this question here, that is it because there could be a negative impact on your PCE revenue, is it a disincentive to do a renewable project potentially, versus where, as Jason mentioned, for an investor-owned utility, they can recover that, I guess, that capital investment potentially if they make it themselves, versus where in your position it may be a different or not as attractive for you to do it?
I guess I wouldn't go that far. I mean, free money is usually pretty attractive. It does create finance woes, the ability to depreciate and collect for those sorts of infrastructure. We have a whole lot of infrastructure now that we've built over the last 20 years that's not necessarily on our books. We can't borrow against it. We don't, the infrastructure is out there, but it doesn't really go into our total capital list of things. So we have to operate it and maintain it. Those costs have gone up, but those are pass-through costs.
Well, I know that. Go ahead, Jason.
Sorry, I was just going to add in this discussion. So, like, I have a very old school utility boss worldview of, like, the utility can do whatever society wants, as long as society is willing to pay something fair for whatever that service is. I think the utility can and should provide that service. So if there are, like, policies or social objectives or things that society wants to see accomplished, I think the utility should do whatever it is. But you got to remove some of the sticks that are in play. And, there's definitely some sticks at work with grant funds and some of the other things that, we're being encouraged to apply for grants to help with infrastructure, but then we also have these challenges in integrating them from, like, a financial and accounting standpoint. And we have challenges in passing the benefits to customers. But I really think the utility can do anything that the public would like, and it should.
On that note, I think that is a good one to end on. I know that we could keep going here, but I have noticed the participants dwindling a little bit. People are getting to lunch. So I just want to again say thank you so much, Bill. Thank you so much, Jason, for offering your perspective. I think it was a really good way to wrap up the day and set up the day for tomorrow, which I know that Dominique is keen to share with where we're going. But just thank you once again for taking part. Thank you for all our panelists, Dominique, and everyone for attending today.
Yes, thank you to Andrew, Jason, and Bill for that panel, and thank you to all of our presenters and attendees who joined us for the first day of the Business of Alaska Rural Energy Workshop. A lot of great information and resources shared today. We will be continuing these important conversations tomorrow, beginning at 8:30 a.m. sharp, Alaska time. And we can take a look at the agenda for tomorrow. For a sneak peek of what's happening tomorrow, we'll kick it off at 8:30, and then at 8:45 we'll have Do Renewables Actually Save Money in Rural Alaska, followed by Pooling Regional Resources before our break. We'll come back with Bulk Fuel Aggregation Study, followed by Building a Utility Collaborative, and we will wrap up with Independent Power Producers Rethinking the Rural Energy Business Model. And so that all starts tomorrow at 8:30 sharp. Thank you so much for everybody for attending today. And once again, thank you to our speakers. Have a great afternoon.